We just had a series of votes, so some members will be coming in and then leaving, and so I apologize that everybody won't be all here at once, but I think we should begin the hearing and go from there. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the situation in Jammu and Kashmir. I especially want to welcome our witnesses, several of whom have traveled to Washington to specifically join us here today. I want to thank you for your interest, and I want to thank you for your commitment. The mandate of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission is to promote, defend, and advocate internationally recognized human rights as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As the Declaration says, and I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and human rights," end quote. And, further quoting, "Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth." Human rights belong to human beings, not states or governments. The role of states is to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of each and every individual in the world. When this commission takes up a human rights situation, it is because we are responding to credible allegations of human rights violations that have reached us from individuals who are affected. We're not doing it to attack a state. Human rights violations can and do happen everywhere in the world, including here in the United States of America. This commission's role is to help and support people who are being hurt by human rights abuses. I say this because we've been inundated with some criticism for holding this hearing today, and I want to set the record straight. This is not an anti-India event. India is a major democracy and a United States ally. Pakistan is also a U.S. ally. But if you're my friend and I'm making mistakes, your role is to tell me and help me change course. I'm blessed to represent a district with a vibrant Indian American and Pakistani American community. The Indian Americans and Pakistani Americans in my district are leaders in business and medicine and so many other fields. And they represent all faiths to be found in South Asia. They are Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Ahmadiyas. People from every faith seem to find their way to Massachusetts, and I'm thrilled by that fact. So we are here today not because of any animus toward India or Pakistan. We are here because many members of this Congress, myself included, have been contacted by constituents with family members in the former Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. Since August, when the Indian government announced that it would change the legal status of Jammu and Kashmir, some of those constituents have not been able to reach their relatives. More than 3 months later, hundreds of people remain in preventive detention without due process protections. The whole area is highly militarized, an estimated 740,000 troops, and there are continuing restrictions on internet and phones in the Kashmir Valley, and no one is being allowed in to observe the situation on the ground. So imagine if it were your family and you couldn't reach them. I think you'd be scared too. Now, many people have said to us that the situation is more complicated than it seems on the surface. There is a long history of terrorist attacks in Kashmir, some cross-border from Pakistan. There was a major suicide attack in February that killed 40 people, for which the Pakistan-based U.S.-designated terrorist group, Jaish-e-Mohammed, took responsibility. So we are told India has a right to defend itself, and that is true. Of course India must defend itself. I condemn terrorist attacks, and every member of this House condemns terrorist attacks. But restrictions placed on people's human rights in the name of counterterrorism must be in accordance with law, and they must be proportionate. Indefinite arbitrary detention, for example, doesn't meet that standard. Here's the thing. There's a long, well-documented history of human rights violations in India and Pakistan, of which the current situation in Kashmir is one part. And there's a long history of human rights violations in Kashmir itself, both in India-administrated and Pakistan-administrated Kashmir. Abuses are interwoven with 3 decades of armed conflict over the status of the region. The Indian government says the conflict has killed 42,000 civilians, militants, and security personnel since 1989. Independent analyses count 70,000 or more. The largest number of those killed have themselves been terrorists, followed by civilians. And thousands more have been forcibly displaced. So the problems we see today in Kashmir did not start in August. They go way back. Under international law, victims of human rights abuses have the right to truth, justice, reparation, and the guarantee of no reoccurrence. None of these rights have been fulfilled to any real degree for Kashmiri victims, either by India or by Pakistan. But both governments are obligated under international law to provide redress for the victims of human rights abuses. So this is a shared problem that requires serious attention by both countries. In 2018 and again in 2019, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued comprehensive reports on the state of human rights in both India-administered and Pakistani-administered Kashmir. These reports and all of their recommendations will be entered into the record of this hearing. Overall, the High Commissioner identified an urgent need to address past and ongoing human rights violations and to deliver justice for all people in Kashmir, for all people. And I'd like to close with one last reflection. This commission has conducted a series of hearings on the prevention of mass atrocities. One of the things we know is that when whole populations are objectified and dehumanized, when whole groups of people come to be seen as the other, the risk of atrocities goes up dramatically. Often that objectification corresponds to religious or ethnic differences. Kashmir's overall population is diverse, but nearly all of the people living in the Kashmir Valley and affected by the most severe restrictions are Muslim. Events since August 5th have already led the organization Genocide Watch to issue a genocide alert for India-administered Kashmir. They already see signs of polarization, discrimination, dehumanization, and persecution. All of us have a responsibility to do our utmost to prevent that kind of outcome. I believe that the first step is to let people into Kashmir, specifically journalists and independent human rights observers, including the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and UN Special Procedures, starting with the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances and the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, and let members of this Congress visit. I would also support the establishment of a comprehensive independent international investigation into all allegations of human rights violations in Kashmir by all parties. An investigation like that could be the first step towards justice and accountability for all the victims of human rights abuses over the last several decades. You know, facts matter. And in that spirit, in addition to the High Commissioner's reports, I will enter into the record the State Department's 2018 country reports on human rights practices for India and Pakistan, as well as USERF's most recent report on religious freedom in both countries. So I look forward to hearing many more recommendations from our witnesses this afternoon. And before I turn to the first panel, I would like to yield to my colleague from Maryland, Mr. Trone, if he has anything he would like to add.
Now we're good to go. We're looking at digging into what's going on in Kashmir in India.
Okay. So now we'll welcome our first panel. Anormir, make sure I'm pronouncing this right. Anorima Bhargava. Did I say that right? Yeah, I'm from Massachusetts, so I sometimes mispronounce everything, so I apologize. Yeah, but she's a commissioner on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, known as USERF, appointed to the commission in 2018 by Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi. She is a civil rights lawyer and founder and president of Anthem of Us. She previously served as the chief of the Educational Opportunity Section of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice and is director of the education practice at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She earned her law degree from Columbia Law School and graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College, and we are honored to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Co-Chair McGovern, and to Co-Chair Smith for convening this hearing on the human rights situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and to focus attention on the freedom of religion and belief within South Asia. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USERF. USERF is an independent and bipartisan U.S. government agency established by the International Religious Freedom Act, or IRFA, to monitor and report on religious freedom conditions abroad and to make policy recommendations to the Congress, State Department, and the President. I am joined by a number of my colleagues, and I'm thankful for the staff that we have that are focused on this region. USERF advocates equally for all religions and for the universal right to believe or not to believe. We employ international human rights standards in our work, and when a government perpetrates or tolerates violations of freedom of religion or belief that are systematic, ongoing, and egregious, USERF recommends to the State Department that the country be designated as a country of particular concern, or CPC. For example, within South Asia, USCIRF has recommended that Pakistan be designated as a CPC, reflecting, among other things, the promulgation of blasphemy and anti-Ahmadiyya laws, which continue a long history of persecution within Pakistan of religious communities, including Shia and Ahmadi Muslims, Hindus, and Christians. USCIRF classified India as a Tier 2 country in its 2019 report. USCIRF found that in 2018, the Indian government perpetrated or tolerated violations of freedom of religion or belief, while they had not yet risen to the CPC level of being systematic, ongoing, and egregious. India is approaching that standard. This trend, unfortunately, has continued and appears to be accelerating in 2019. A focal point around religious freedom conditions in India, and the reason we have gathered here today, are the recent actions taken by the Indian government in majority Muslim Jammu and Kashmir. These actions are part of a complex history of displacement and violence toward long-standing religious communities, including the Kashmiri Pundits, which I understand others will testify about today and USCIRF has reported upon. USCIRF is concerned about reports starting in August that the Indian government restricted freedom of movement and assembly, limiting people's ability to attend prayers and participate in religious activities, forestalling any large gatherings, including for religious purposes, and for certain communities, curtailing access to healthcare and other basic services. USCIRF has also seen reports of mosques being closed, imams and Muslim community leaders arrested and detained, and violence and threats toward residents and businesses in certain religious communities. While it is beyond USCIRF's scope to comment on the political and security situation in Jammu and Kashmir, we are concerned about both the perception and the reality, which has been difficult to document and accurately understand given the restrictions on communications in the region, that Muslims' religious freedom are being curtailed as a consequence of the Indian government's actions. Indian government officials have stated a goal of restoring normalcy within the region as quickly as possible, which must at minimum ensure that the freedoms of religion and belief for all are honored and protected, and that religious persecution and violence and the fear of such persecution and violence is actively countered and addressed. I want to spend a few minutes talking about religious freedom conditions in India more broadly. India has a rich tradition of secular pluralism, as recognized and protected by its constitution. The country's political leadership has consistently struggled to balance protections for its religious minorities against majoritarian forces. More recently, the Bharatiya Janata Party, under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, came into power in 2014 and successfully won re-election in a landslide in 2019 with strong appeals to Hindu nationalism. And throughout the country, political and community leaders are promulgating an ideology that suggests that to be Indian is necessarily to be Hindu, and views India's religious minorities as subordinate or foreign. That ideology has taken root in policies and actions at the state level, and increasingly in proposals and appeals at the national level that are resulting in the persecution and targeting of religious minorities. A key example is the update of the National Register of Citizens, or NRC, in the northeastern state of Assam, which borders Bangladesh and Bhutan. The NRC was originally introduced in 1951 as part of India's first census and served as a registry to identify Indian citizens. In the 1970s and 80s, concerns about immigrants, largely focused on ethnic Bengalis, grew among the Assamese. As a result, the Indian government signed the Assam Accord in 1985, which called for an update to the NRC in Assam as an instrument to identify so-called, quote, illegal immigrants. It wasn't until a 2014 ruling, however, by the Indian Supreme Court that the Assamese government began this process by requiring all Assam residents to provide documentation of citizenship or their ancestor citizenship as of 1971. The final NRC list, issued in August of 2019, excluded 1.9 million residents of Assam. Individuals excluded from the NRC have until December 31st, 2019, to appeal their citizenship status to recently established foreigner tribunals. Human rights groups have asserted and documented that the foreigner tribunals are rife for abuse, something I'm happy, would welcome questions about in the Q&A. In general, the NRC process in Assam has raised three concerns. First, there is a lack of clarity on what happens after the appeals process concludes. The concern is that those excluded will be deemed stateless. If rendered stateless, they can become subject to detention in camps, expulsion, exploitation, discrimination, and violence from state and non-state actors, much like what has taken place with the Rohingya in Burma. Indeed, the genocide and displacement of the Rohingya started with a citizenship verification process eerily similar to the NRC. USCIRF has recently received information from Indian government officials assuring us that exclusion from the NRC, quote, has no implication on the rights of an individual resident in Assam, end quote, does not make the excluded person stateless, and, quote, does not make him or her a foreigner under the Foreigners Act of 1947. Consequently, those excluded from the NRC, quote, will not be deprived from any rights or entitlements which they have enjoyed before, end quote. We hope that the NRC process in Assam and throughout India moves forward consistent with these statements. USCIRF will continue to monitor the situation closely. Second, as USCIRF and many other organizations have raised, is a concern that the NRC process is an effort to target Muslims in Assam. When it was discovered that Bengali Hindus were excluded alongside Bengali Muslims, several state and local political leaders sought to assure Hindus not to worry and that the error would be rectified, and denounced the NRC process for not working as it was intended. Political leaders announced plans to reintroduce in the next Lok Sabha session the Citizenship Amendment Bill that would allow non-Muslim immigrants from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh a shorter and more direct path to Indian citizenship. Muslims, however, are effectively defaulted to the, quote, illegal immigrant, quote, end quote, category that the NRC was put in place to root out. The third concern, made ever more salient by the expected introduction of the Citizenship Amendment Bill, is that several state-level politicians are pushing for an NRC within their states, including Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, and West Bengal, and BJP President and Home Minister Amit Shah is advocating for a nationwide NRC. Such efforts could threaten the citizenship of millions of Indians. More information about the NRC can be found in a USCIRF issue brief which we have released today. I've included information in my written testimony about other religious freedom challenges in India, such as anti-conversion laws, the destruction of places of worship, and inflammatory rhetoric that has stoked violence across the country. I'm happy to answer questions about any of those issues. India's religious minorities currently stand at a precipice. If the Indian government continues on its current trajectory, their livelihood, rights, and freedoms could be in even more serious danger. USCIRF urges Congress and the administration to remain vigilant in monitoring how the NRC proceeds and the introduction of the Citizenship Amendment Bill and anti-conversion bills at the national level, and of course the steps being taken in Jammu and Kashmir. In my written testimony, I'll lay out more specific recommendations for the U.S. government in engaging with India on religious freedom issues. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. I have a few questions. We have some of my colleagues who have joined us here today, but and we have a panel that's going to follow you as well. So I appreciate, and all of your testimony in detail will be submitted for the record. Let me ask you, how important is it for USCIRF's work to be able to visit the countries that you focus on? And do you require an invitation from a government to visit?
So it's extraordinarily important to be able to visit a country and get a sense of a direct and firsthand look at what is happening within the regions that we are concerned about, and frankly across the country. We do require a country to allow us to be able to visit it as it is a diplomatic visit, and we unfortunately have not had the opportunity to visit India for close to 15 years.
And what about Pakistan?
We have had the opportunity to visit Pakistan, and are currently in a process to visit Pakistan in the next year.
And were you able to visit, I mean, obviously, what about the Pakistani administered part of Kashmir? Were you able to visit that?
I'm not sure if we've actually been able to visit Pakistan administrated Kashmir in the past, and we can certainly look into that for the trip that is upcoming.
And I know you said that you included recommendations in your submitted testimony, but maybe just give us a couple of top-line items as to what would be the most important steps for members of the Congress to take to support USCIRF's efforts in both India and Pakistan.
So I would point you to a couple of things. I think there's, for India, we want to make sure that there is close monitoring of these two bills that are expected to be introduced in the lower parliament in the Lok Sabha this next session, which starts next week. And the reason for that was that it would be literally national level policy actions that are taken. By that I mean the Citizenship Amendment Bill and the Anti-Conversion Bill that would bring some of these policies that have raised concerns to the national level. The second thing would be that there are a number of ways in which both officials who have been engaging in hate and those who have been spreading hate, which is part of the reason we're seeing communal and mob violence in some parts of India against religious minorities, that there be actions taken to try and address those individuals in particular.
And does USURF share Genocides Watch concern about the risk of atrocities or genocide in Kashmir?
I think the Indian government is trying to take steps to establish some sense of normalcy in Kashmir. I think that what has happened so far since August has raised a host of concerns about the livelihood and well-being and, frankly, simple basic health and welfare of those who are living in the region, and the kind of persecution and violence that particular communities have been facing. Obviously, as you've already noted, and as I noted in my remarks, it has been difficult to understand and appreciate what is going on in the region, given the kinds of communication channels, the ways in which communication channels have actually not been in place in the way that anyone would have wanted.
Before I yield to Mr. Trone, let me just say I've never had the privilege of visiting Pakistan. I hope to do so someday. I did have the privilege of visiting India, and it is a magnificent country. I was just so in awe of the diverse cultures and ethnic backgrounds and just history, and it just is a remarkable place. And so I mean, so that's and I think that's one of the reasons why I think some of us are deeply concerned about this current moment, because I look at India as a friend, and we want our friends to live up to the expectations we all have, just like we want our country to live up to its expectations. And so I appreciate your testimony. I'm happy to yield to Mr. Trone.
Thank you very much for being here today, and thank you for your comments and the great work you're doing for human rights. Mike, completely agree with your point and the chairman's point that visiting the country is so important, and being in Kashmir to observe what's happening from a human rights standpoint is essential. Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland, I just spoke to him very recently. He was denied entry by the Indian government. USURF has not been allowed. What reason did the Indian government given you for those denials?
I think the Indian government in the past has had concerns about some of the issues that have been raised by USURF. I hope that is changing. We have engaged with Indian government officials who have been very helpful in understanding some of what is going on in response to concerns that we're currently raising. And I hope that process is one that allows us not only to have constructive and positive engagement, but also allows us to go into the country. In the past couple of months, I've had a chance to visit Burma and Bangladesh, Iraq, and Vietnam, and I can tell you that there is no substitute for the ability to actually hear directly not only from stakeholders and members of communities throughout the country, but also from government officials themselves.
We completely agree. It's absolutely essential that Western diplomats and USURF be able to visit Kashmir. As you pointed out, India's had a long history of secular democracy, where religious communities of every faith have thrived. Yet it also points in a downward trend for religious freedom conditions. What factors have led to the Commission to make this assessment, and what policies should the Indian government implement to reverse what you see as a downward trend?
So I think a number of the things I spoke about in my testimony today are what's contributing to the downward trend. There is, again, this growing movement and ideology around Hindu nationalism, a sense perception and also reality that religious minorities within India are in a state of both fear and active persecution and violence. And so, and that has taken place in many different types of forums. The concerns that we have right now about processes like the NRC, which are basically processes that will allow for certain communities certain religious communities to be discriminated against in the way in which they've been set up and possibly in the way in which they've been implemented. Those are things that we are trying to make sure that we raise. I join Congressman McGovern in the sense that India is my homeland and the place of my ancestry, and it is a place that for much of its history and in the way in which I understood it, it is a place where we respect and accord dignity to people of all different religious backgrounds. And there are many stories, including in Jammu and Kashmir right now, of Hindus who are taking care of mosques, of Muslims who are taking care of temples. And those are the stories of the India that we would like to be able to see. Unfortunately, it's not what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, people stepping up to help people regardless of religion, absolutely fantastic. But India does have legitimate security concerns. In Kashmir, we agree, but we want to acknowledge that ensuring security doesn't have to mean, can mean ensuring protection of human rights at the same time. And they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, they never should be. So what would a model look like for protecting these religious freedoms at the same time as we protect the safety of the population?
You know, as we've ourselves heard from Indian government officials, the vast majority of those who live in Jammu and Kashmir, the vast majority of people who live in communities across India are not engaged in violence or any kind of threats to national security. And what we're seeing is a blunt instrument that is taking away rights and freedoms of people across the board to be able to engage in basic daily activities and also to be able to practice their faith. And so there certainly can be a balance. The balance that's being struck right now is one that is resulting in persecution and violence, in many places around the country, and also that's tolerating what we're seeing in terms of, both in the rhetoric that's coming from local and state leaders, and even some of those at the national level, that is tolerating and giving a sense of impunity to people who are engaged in violent, non-state actors who engage in violence, and that's also of extraordinary concern.
Can we just quickly jump? The last quick question is,
Sure.
The Indian government's been conducting efforts to verify the citizenship of residents in Assam, and my constituents have raised concerns that while technically everybody is being asked to provide proof of citizenship, this appears to be disproportionately impacting Muslims. Is the Commission on International Religious Freedom monitoring the developments here? And do you see any other concerning signs? And how can we make sure the rights of Muslims and minorities are not harmed in this process?
So as I talked about in my testimony, I think what's happening in Assam with the NRC, and frankly the way in which it's being implemented, is a process that is open to a range of concerns. So for example, the 1.9 million residents of Assam who have been found not to have the documentation to demonstrate their citizenship, and frankly, they're being asked for documentation from decades ago. And so, as is the case here, but in the case in any part of the world, a lot of people don't have that kind of documentation. They might not have it in the form that is necessary. They might not have it in exactly the right name. And so we're seeing a situation in which people, their very ability to stay and stay safely in the place that they have lived is being threatened. And the foreigner tribunals, which have been set up for any kind of appeals process at this point, have a number of concerns that have been raised about those, which is that they are not open to the public or to the press or to even family members, that they haven't been transparent in their decision making, that those who are actually on the foreigner tribunals who are making these decisions, these life decisions about people's citizenship status, are people who they've lowered the qualifications for people to be on those tribunals, and they're not actually in a position to be qualified to make those kinds of determinations. And so given all of that, there are concerns that what's going to happen here is this is a means, and the reason we have this sense of it being a way to target a particular religious community is because people have literally come out and said that that was the purpose of it, right? And that's the purpose of trying to expand a similar process to other states and to the national level. And when you hear that the purpose of that kind of process is not to actually get a sense, there's already a census, but it's not to get a sense of who has lived somewhere, but who should be expelled or rendered, stateless in a process. That's something that is of certain concern. Again, as I mentioned, we have just heard from Indian government officials that a lot of the concerns that we raised are ones that they will try to mitigate against. I really do hope that that is what happens here, and are heeding what they're saying in terms of what's going to happen with great anticipation that that's what they actually do.
Thank you for your insights.
Thank you. And just so I want to recognize people in the order they came here. So Mr. Cicilline, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and then Ms. Jackson-Lee. Okay.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, for calling this hearing, and thank you so much for your testimony. I think there are many of us who have been following the situation inside Jammu and Kashmir very closely since the August 5th decision to revoke Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. And we have all heard reports of mass arbitrary detention, including of local political leaders, curfews restricting access to telephone and the internet, and restricting the ability of citizens to peacefully protest or organize. I met with constituents back in Rhode Island who have family members in Kashmir who have been subject to violence by the Indian police for attempting to engage in peaceful political protest. And there have been widespread stories about the lack of food and medicine and telecommunications, leading to avoidable deaths of people within Jammu and Kashmir. I'm particularly concerned about the religious motives that seem to be at play here, with the majority BJP party couching this move as a return to Hindu nationalism in India. And of course, we're speaking of provinces that are majority Muslim and which include many religious and ethnic minorities. Several of us have raised these concerns directly with the government of India, and last month I sent a letter along with Chairman McGovern and 5 of our colleagues asking the Indian ambassador here in D.C. to respond to some specific questions. So I first asked that that letter be made a part of this record. I ask unanimous consent. Thank you. I'm particularly concerned that the Indian government, which has been a very important partner to the United States, seems unconcerned by the stories emerging from Jammu and Kashmir, and they seem willing to take decidedly undemocratic steps in order to achieve their political goals. The relationship between our two countries is based on a foundation of mutual respect for democracy and human rights, and these actions seem to fly in the face of those values, and your testimony confirms my concerns. I, too, have had the privilege of visiting India, and it's a beautiful and magnificent country and a vibrant democracy, and these actions seem to be really contrary to that history. What I really want to ask you about is some of the causation. So USCIRF reported has really called out the Modi government for not doing enough to address this downward trend that you've described. In your 2018 report, you state, and I quote, "Modi has done little to provide justice for victims of large-scale past incidents of communal violence, often caused by inflammatory speeches delivered by leaders of Modi's party." And in 2017, in your USCIRF report, you say that members of the ruling party have ties to Hindu nationalist groups implicated in religious freedom violations, used religiously divisive language to inflame tensions, and called for additional laws that would restrict religious freedom. Given your own reporting, or USCIRF's own reporting, do you believe that India's ruling party is at least partly responsible for the rise of persecution against religious minorities? And in addition to that, what are the other factors contributing to this?
So the way in which we look at the role of a government, right, in the persecution and violence towards religious minorities is the ways in which they directly are involved in that violence, but also the ways in which that violence is tolerated. And part of what there's widespread concern about is that when we're seeing communal and mob violence in places around India, when people are filing complaints known as first information reports, those are not being addressed seriously, and so people don't have a recourse for the kind of violence that they're experiencing, especially for religious minority populations. As I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why we are concerned all of what is in the report from 2018, and again, I think what's in the report is continuing in 2019. But what we're seeing is that something like the Citizenship Amendment Bill, which specifically excludes Muslims, right, is something that was proposed in the Lok Sabha in January of 2019 and was withdrawn due to protest, that it would then again be reintroduced now, right? And reintroduced at a time where there are many different things that are going on in India, which again, perceived and actually are impacting religious minorities and making them feel like they are in grave fear, right, for their lives and their ability to conduct their businesses in a safe way, to be able to even walk around their neighborhoods, right? And so we've seen, in the last week, there have been, one of the most significant court rulings in Indian history on an area called Ayodhya and the Babri Mosque, and that is something that again you have to take into account in terms of the feeling of people around India about whether or not they're feeling targeted, they're feeling like their rights and freedoms are being curtailed. And again, the anti-conversion law, which has been something that we've seen in states around India, there have not been any, to our knowledge, have been few, if any, convictions under those laws. But again, we see this push to bring that anti-conversion law to the national level. So what we're seeing is a situation in which some of the things that have percolated at the local and state level are rising to the national level, and to the extent that kind of trend continues, it raises a bunch of concerns about not only actions that are resulting in discrimination and harassment and violence and intimidation of religious communities, but those that are actually intended to do that.
And finally, in your 2019 report, you explain that campaigns led by RSS, and I'm quoting, to alienate non-Hindus or lower caste Hindus, is a significant contributor to the rise of religious violence and persecution. Can you describe for me the relationship or the nature of the relationship between the RSS and its relationship with the PJP? Because I think the history here is really important.
I don't think I could do that any justice in the minutes that we have. What I would say is that, I think the relationship of the BJP to the RSS, and then how you think about that in the patchwork of states across India, which have such diverse populations, and we're seeing, so part of this is we're seeing very different things in different states and in different localities across the country. When we see some of that rise to the level that we're seeing at a national level, in terms of some of the concerns that we're worried about in particular states coming to the national fore, that's when we're sounding the alarm in the way that we are right now. And with regards to the different groups and frankly political leadership within India, I don't want to ascribe to any particular party or to any particular group the statements or the actions of any one particular leader. But what I do think is important to note is the ways in which those statements that are coming out of political leaders, whether they be at any level of government, are ones that, again, if they go unchecked, can lead to a sense, of persecution and violence, and also a sense that people can act with impunity. And so that's the way in which some of this plays out. But the history of the RSS and BJP and many other political parties across India is one that we would have to spend another hearing on.
Yeah, thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Ms. Bargava, for being here. I've met with some constituents back home in Pennsylvania who have family members in Kashmir, and I just wanted to relay a few of their concerns and see if you could comment. Obviously, what's been raised is the concerns about transparency, press not being given access, members of Congress not being given access to the region, number one. And number two, the disruption of communications, whether it be internet, cell phone usage, and also concerns about health care and health care services available for their loved ones there, who many of them had no ability to communicate with them, some still. What are you seeing, what are you hearing with regard to those items?
I think we've heard a lot of what many of you have described, which is the curtailing of communications. A number of stories of people trying to actually get medical help and not being able to have the freedom of movement or the ability to access, again, healthcare or any other basic services. And again, to go back to the scope of our work, the two focal points, in terms of Jammu and Kashmir are, one, how those kinds of policies impact the ability of people to exercise their religion or their faith, right? So what we've also heard is the ways in which that's impacting people's ability to go pray, and that's people of all different religious backgrounds, or their ability to be able to engage in religious activities. The other way in which we are concerned, and I think it's reflected in a lot of what you just described, is when those kinds of restrictions are placed on any particular religious community. And as we've noted, Jammu and Kashmir are majority Muslim areas, right, and have a majority Muslim population. And in some ways, the kinds of restrictions that we're seeing are impacting, they're certainly impacting the communities in Jammu and Kashmir across the board. There have been reports of particularly egregious ways in which they're impacting certain communities across that area, and in all the ways in which you've just described. I think we are, again, all of us, I think, are hearing some of the same kinds of reports from constituents, from groups, from those who've had some ability to access the region. And unfortunately, I think we're all hamstrung in the same way, which is that without the ability to have what, as I describe it, accurate information, that comes through channels that we can actually have some trust in. It's hard to understand where those reports are coming from and to verify them, but it's also hard to understand and verify some of the ways in which we've certainly heard from the government that they are trying to address those concerns. And so I think we're at a loss, right, to be able to understand what's going on in the region, and that's one of the most egregious problems with this process is that we've now had a couple of months now where we haven't been able to understand really what's going on there.
As far as the communication networks and the disruption, what's your understanding of what the current status of that is?
I can only share what I've heard from both from government officials and also from the kind of reports that you're hearing, which is both a lack of internet, and then on the cell phone, and there's been some distinctions made between prepaid and postpaid, and I tell you, I fail to understand some of those distinctions. But what I would say is that communications, there have been many reports of people not being able to access any kind of communications, both in and out of the region. Those were particularly acute in the first couple of weeks of August. I think that there have been some ways in which people have been able to access and talk to their relatives and others, which is part of the reason why we're getting the kind of information that we're getting. There've certainly been journalists who have both within India, and I think there's some extraordinary courageous and journalists within India who have been able to travel to the region and report on what's going on. But in general, I think it's just been it's certainly not a situation in which, to talk about establishing and returning to normalcy, that we've seen people's communication channels be restored to what they were prior to August.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Go back.
Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I appreciate your response to our discussion on the floor. Thank you again. I think this is an appropriate moment to acknowledge the late Tom Lantos, who really wanted us to find a way to be proponents, no matter how unpopular it would be, for human rights. And in many instances, when you begin to speak about human rights, you become unpopular. Because you are obviously taking up human rights and suggesting that others are not performing as they should. So let me have a line of questioning that will speak to this challenge of getting information. And I'd be interested in, how do you perceive the path should be to get direct, if I might use the term, pure and effective information for the members of Congress to be able to act on. Our constituents have indicated a myriad of issues, we can't seem to get whether those issues have been relieved, whether there's relief given. So that's the first question. The second question would be dealing with, have you had any knowledge about the issue of medical care, which I find most daunting and most devastating. If people are not able to get medical care in the region, then I view that as great concern. I join my colleagues who I know have mentioned that we are friends of India and Pakistan. This happens to be in a region that was designed during the British partition, and it was designed this way. And also it happens to include a predominant number, as I understand, of the Muslim population. There are about 200 million Muslims, and I can be corrected, in India. Pakistan, of course, is a strong Muslim state. Both are beautiful if you've ever been. So I would ask the question about being able to get direct information, if you have any direct information on the medical care. And then if you could speak to the legislative act, which I find stunning, is to the elimination of resolution, or H370, which seemingly has caused this spiraling downhill of being able to try and resolve an issue that I think should be resolved on the side of human rights. Are these individuals, along with other religious minorities, getting human rights from a very powerful country? And that's what should be understood. If you have power, then your humanity should cause you to use that power to be humane to others. And so if you could ask that, and I have a follow-up question, getting real information. I take note of the fact that one of our dear friends, Senator Van Hollen, was blocked from going into the Indian part of Jammu and Kashmir. And if others want to get information, do you have any understanding of how one can get into the whole area, the whole region, to get facts?
Thank you for the question, and Congresswoman Jackson-Lee, I, as a longtime civil and human rights lawyer, I understand both how it's necessary and often unpopular to speak about things that are going on in this country and in places like India and Pakistan. And so let me just start by saying, unfortunately, as we've noted, USCIRF has not been able to make any kind of visits to India for close to 15 years. And so we don't have the kind of direct engagement and the ability to gather information in the way in which I think you and so many others in this conversation have asked for and understand the import of being able to have that kind of direct information for any of us to be able to address or propose recommendations on how to fix some of these problems. I think it's fair to say that given the numbers of reports that are coming out of the region, that at least some of what we're hearing has to be things that have been verified, and that we and that we certainly can that underscore the kind of concerns that we all have about healthcare, about access to services, and
you can't verify it. You can't verify it, or you can't deny it.
I don't think any of us can verify it at this point, because I don't think there is or deny it, right? And so I think the difficulty is that we're all kind of in the same position, which is we're hearing reports. There are a lot of concerns and that are being raised on a host of issues, right? From the ability of people to actually even be able to open and conduct their businesses safely, right, without fear that they will literally be subject to violence for doing so, to access to food, to healthcare, to basic services. Again, from our perspective, we are focused on the concerns that we have heard about the ability to worship, to go to places to pray, to gather on religious holidays and in religious activities, and the ways in which any of these processes have impacted religious communities in particular, right? But we just don't have the ability to get the information that I think any of us would want to be able to verify any of that. And so that's where we are. And I deeply appreciate that that we are starting to have conversations at USERF with Indian government officials. I hope that continues because, to me, you know, the ways in which we can move forward is to try and have a situation in which we have constructive engagement on the concerns that we're talking about, and that's not something we can have if only one person has the information.
You have a comment on Resolution 370, and any comment on other religious minorities?
I think as I talked about in my testimony, I have a lot of concerns about other actions that are being taken around India with regards to the registration of citizens, you know, this National Register of Citizens, which is a way in which, unfortunately, there are concerns about how that's being used, how that may be used to target religious communities, and particularly Muslims in the state of Assam and in a number of other states around the country. I have concerns about anti-conversion laws that are due to be introduced at the national level, about communal and mob violence that we're seeing around the country that is going unchecked, where police and local law enforcement are not taking the kinds of actions that they should take to address that kind of violence. And we're seeing, as we are seeing, you know, throughout South Asia, the perpetuation of hate and rhetoric that are really targeting religious communities, and are doing so in a way that is, you know, very quickly and in very deadly ways, leading to violence for religious minorities. And so, for all of those reasons, you know, I think there are many concerns throughout India that that are impacting the ways in which we're looking at religious freedom conditions there. Jammu and Kashmir and the, you know, and Article 370 are just, you know, one of the many ways in which we're seeing these concerns manifest.
Do you, Mr. Chairman, I will just, if she doesn't answer it, I just want to put it on the record. I asked specifically the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights of the State Department to actively get engaged and involved. And just, have you seen the State Department taking a real leadership role in trying to work with both, in this instance, both India and Pakistan to bring relief to the people?
So I don't know if the State Department has had an opportunity to visit Jammu and Kashmir. I know that there has been a State Department delegation, particularly of Ambassador Sam Brownback, who is the envoy on international religious freedom issues, who has just recently gone to India, and so I'm hoping that there has been engagement on these issues. I don't know in particular what the State Department has been able to do or has been doing in the last couple of months with regard to Jammu and Kashmir and some of these other issues. Our role at USERF is to make recommendations to the State Department about what we think that they should be doing, and certainly the first and foremost among that is for the State Department to engage and to monitor what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir, what's happening with the National Register of Citizens, and what's happening with a number of the ways in which violence is being perpetuated across the country.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look
you.
forward to the second panel.
Thank you very much. And before we get to the second panel, I want to acknowledge Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. I don't know if you want to say anything right now.
If we have time, I'd
You
love
do?
to.
I would.
Okay.
I would.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for your incredible leadership on human rights on so many issues. And thank you, Ms. Bhargava, for being here to testify today. You know, I'm very proud that I have the somewhat unique opportunity of having been a citizen of what I believe the greatest and the largest democracies in the world. For 35 years, I was a citizen of India, and now I have the great honor of being the first Indian American woman elected to Congress and being a citizen of this great country. And I have deep regard for the relationship between the two countries and a pretty unique perspective on India. My parents still live there. And I have followed this situation very, very closely. And as you know, I have spoken out on this, some with the chairman. We have sent letters together. And I've been following the situation very closely. And the question of religious intolerance in particular has been one that has been plaguing me, because I think one of the great things about India has been our attention to religious freedom, some of the world's greatest religions born and nurtured in India. And so I am deeply concerned that the Indian government's actions in Kashmir to detain people without charge, severely limit communications, and block neutral third parties from visiting are harmful to our close and critical relationship. And I had two specific questions for you. I'm sorry I missed your testimony, but I have excellent notes here. You mentioned in your testimony issues with people in Kashmir going to worship at mosques and being prevented from accessing their houses of worship. Can you describe a little bit more what you mean by that? Why are they unable to do so? And then secondly, how has the communications blackout and the mass detentions impacted that specific ability to worship?
Sure. So I think particularly in the first couple of weeks of August, where there was restrictions, if not, complete inability to move within the region, there were many reports about people not being able to go pray, to be able to go to their houses of worship, and in particular, as as the months have gone by, where there are a number of religious holidays that have come up for Muslim communities and for Hindu communities in Jammu and Kashmir, the ability to actually gather for those kinds of holidays and to be able to engage in religious activities in that way have been places that we have been concerned about the ways in which those restrictions have played out. So I think that we're hearing reports. It's hard to verify those reports and to understand, where they're coming from, the extent of them, the scale of it, how many people are being impacted, and again, without the ability to verify, it's something that we do understand, and certainly even the government will say that there was a period of disruption, and where there were limitations on people's ability to do many things, right? That includes certainly a number of the religious activities that people would normally be able to do on a day-to-day basis, and for so many are critical to the practice of their faith.
And you also mentioned in your testimony that you have several recommendations for congressional action to protect religious freedom in India. Specific to Jammu and Kashmir, what can we do to ensure that people have freedom of worship and belief? What are the things you think Congress should focus on there?
Sure. I think again, from the religious freedom and belief perspective and the scope of USERF, the two things that we are most worried about in Jammu and Kashmir are, again, these restrictions on the ability of people across the board to be able to practice their faith. And secondly, the ways in which restrictions and assertions about, whether or not people should be able to exercise their rights have been targeted towards particular religious communities, right? And so the concerns of in a majority Muslim, for majority Muslim population, the concerns that are being raised about the need to actually have some of these blanket restrictions for security purposes that would impact the entire population are ones where we're worried about obviously the impact on that on the majority Muslim population and on communities around the region. And so those are the things that we've heard reports again about, but that we have not been able to, like anyone else, right, be able to visit and engage in the kind of fact gathering where we can verify and have an accurate understanding of what's going on.
I have one last question quickly, and that is, I go back to visit my parents every year, and I will tell you that this time I was struck by the change in attitude towards people's belief that they were protected in whatever religion. And it actually wasn't just Muslims, it was also lower caste Hindus and others. Can you comment on specifically what you have seen around the rise of those kinds of fears from multiple communities in India over the last several years?
So USERF has not had a chance to visit India as a commission in close to 15 years. I have had the chance to go with my family to visit India, and I felt similarly, in terms of the kind of energies and the conversations and the ways in which a country that for a long time you would see, and I think about a time I spent in Ahmedabad where there had been significant religious violence, but time I've spent in Ahmedabad in the old part of the city where people of different religious backgrounds are literally living in peace right next to each other, and the ways in which we don't spend the time thinking about how religious communities can live in peace rather than in violence. And so I've seen that. And it's something that, you know, that's been a way in which to think about how we actually model that in places around the world, including here. And unfortunately, you know, there's nothing I can point to, but there's that sense that you just described, that the ways in which people are talking about different religious communities, the ways in which they're talking about their neighbors, the ways in which people feel this sort of sense of fear and persecution, or that they can actually talk about people in a way that doesn't actually respect their dignity and their faith, and in a way that I had not heard as much before, is something that I too witnessed while I was there. But again, it was not in my capacity as a commissioner, which you know, I very much want to be able to visit India and to engage, you know, with communities and with government officials and with NGOs to understand, you know, in a closer way what's going on. One thing I just want to note is that, you know, I spoke a lot about the way in which citizenship and the very notion of citizenship is becoming, unfortunately, in the region as a whole, in Burma and places like that, a tool for religious persecution and violence. In India, we're seeing that as well. Some of those concerns being raised, as I talked about in terms of the National Register of Citizens in Assam and how that might actually expand across the country. In addition, what we're seeing is, you know, for those who are raising concerns, both within the country and outside of the country, the ways in which people who are criticizing that kind of intolerance, that kind of concern about the ways in which you're hearing rhetoric that is grounded in hate, right, or grounded in division. When we see people who are criticizing that, you know, also seeing their citizenship threatened, revoked, that is another way in which that atmosphere is something that is of significant, you know, is something that we're seeing and is of significant concern.
Very important. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGovern, thank you so much for being here, and we certainly appreciate all the work that USERF does, and thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Of course. Thank you very much.
You. Now I'm going to call up our second panel, and if I mispronounce anybody's name, please correct me immediately. Dr. Haley Dushinsky, who's the Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director of Center of Law, Justice, and Culture at Ohio University. She's a founding member of the Critical Kashmir Studies Scholarly Collective and co-editor of the recently published edited volume, Resisting Occupation in Kashmir. Her research has appeared in several academic journals, and she's a member of the Kashmir Scholars Consultative and Action Network. Sela Ushai is a Kashmiri American attorney and human rights activist who focuses on immigration, racial religious discrimination, and women's rights, a graduate of Johns Hopkins University and University of Michigan Law School. Ms. Ushai received the Henry Bates and Clara Belfield Fellowship from the University of Michigan Law School in 2005 to study the state subjects law of Kashmir. She has worked as a federal judicial law clerk, a legal aid attorney, a human rights program consultant, domestically and internationally, and the director of the immigration litigation for a nonprofit focused on serving the Muslim community. Yusra Fazili is an attorney and a special policy advisor on the Middle East and North Africa to various U.S. government agencies in Washington, D.C. Under the Obama administration, she worked with the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, where her work focused on public sector strategic planning, global nuclear security, and international negotiations. She has served as an independent consultant to organizations including the U.S. Institute for Peace, Stanford Design School, and the United Nations. A Fulbright Scholar, she is a graduate of Harvard University, Brown University, and American University's Washington College of Law. Her academic research has focused on gender and Islamic law. Arjen Sethi is a human rights lawyer, community activist, author, and law professor based in Washington, D.C. He works closely with the Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and Sikh communities and advocates for racial justice, equality, and social change at the local and national levels. He served as a legal observer across the world, including military commissions at Guantanamo Bay. He holds faculty appointments at Georgetown University Law Center and Vanderbilt University Law School, and presently co-chairs the American Bar Association's National Committee on Homeland Security, Terrorism, and Treatment of Enemy Combatants. Sunanda Vashisht. Yeah, good. I'll make sure. Has over 15 years of experience as a writer, political commentator, columnist, and social media influencer. She works to connect with American policymakers to educate them on issues of India and the Indian diaspora. She has written for several news organizations and has been a regular columnist for Daily News and Analysis DNA. Her area of focus has been on the conflict in the Kashmir Valley. And last but not least, John Sifton is Asia Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. He works on South and Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa. He began working at Human Rights Watch in 2001, first as a researcher in the Asia Division, focusing on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then as senior researcher on terrorism and counterterrorism. Previously, he founded a public interest investigation firm and worked for the International Rescue Committee. He holds a law degree from New York University and a bachelor's degree from St. John's College in Annapolis. So I want to welcome you all here. This is kind of a big panel, but if you could keep your remarks to 5 or so minutes. We're pretty liberal up here, but I want to make sure everybody gets to say what they need to say, and we have some time for questions. So, Dr. Dushinsky, we'll begin with you. Just make sure your mic is on. Is it
This one?
Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Co-Chair McGovern and members of the Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the history and the context of human rights violations in Kashmir. Today is the 103rd day of siege in Kashmir. On August 5th, the government of India revoked constitutional provisions granting provisional autonomy to the state of Jammu and Kashmir and announced the creation of 2 separate federally administered union territories, which came into effect on October 31st. Kashmir scholars argue that these unilateral actions constitute the 3rd stage in India's longstanding occupation of Kashmir. The first stage began when the Maharaja of the princely state signed the Instrument of Accession in 1947 as a temporary legal and political arrangement born of necessity during war, decolonization, and partition on the subcontinent. The UN Security Council issued a series of resolutions acknowledging the provisional nature of the accession and establishing that Kashmir's political future would be determined through a plebiscite. In writing the constitution of the new nation, India's Constituent Assembly included Article 370 to incorporate the conditional and provisional accession into the Constitution. The second stage of Indian occupation of Kashmir began in the late 1980s as Kashmiris launched a popular armed rebellion against the Indian state. India sought to crush the rebellion through a massive counterinsurgency assault against armed and civilian populations, deploying more than 700,000 state-armed forces in the region. Although the armed rebellion faded by the late 1990s, India's counterinsurgency regime has remained in place. International human rights bodies have condemned extrajudicial killings, illegal detentions, torture, sexual violence, forced labor, disappearance, and mass graves across the last 3 decades. The third stage of Indian occupation of Kashmir began on August 5, 2019. The Indian government's unilateral abrogation of J&K's special status is in serious violation of past UN Security Council resolutions regarding the Kashmiri right to self-determination, and it irreversibly erases the limited legal recognition and protection of self-governance, legal autonomy, and citizenship rights for Kashmiris. Such maneuvers signal an intention to carry out far-reaching changes to demographic and landholding patterns by opening up Kashmir to settlement by outsiders who were previously restricted from purchasing land in the region. To carry out these massive legal and political transformations, the government of India has imposed extremely restrictive measures through the current siege. And the testimony today is based on credible media sources, as well as 6 fact-finding reports written by highly respected Indian civil society groups. During the siege, we have seen widespread violations of rights to life, liberty, and the security of persons. The government of India claims that more than 3,800 people have been detained since August 5th and that 2,600 of them have been released. The fact-finding reports indicate that the number of detentions is in fact higher than 10,000. In a recent interview, the leading Kashmiri civil liberties lawyer Parvez Imroz reported that as many as 20 to 30,000 detentions have occurred primarily of juveniles. Many of these are illegal, undocumented, and incommunicado detentions, which have a disappearance effect, as family members are unable to ascertain the whereabouts of detainees. Credible sources have reported allegations of torture by armed security personnel, including broadcasting sounds of beatings and pleas for mercy over loudspeakers for the purpose of terrorizing the population. We've also seen failures of the administration of justice, access to justice, and the rule of law. This includes the targeting of the legal community, the non-functioning of the J&K High Court, and the delay of habeas corpus petitions and the lack of due process at the High Court and the Supreme Court of India. I'd like to say a few words about minority communities in the region. There are several ethnic and religious minorities in Indian-administered Kashmir. The recent legal maneuvers impact all indigenous residents, including majority and minority ethnic and religious groups living in J&K and those who have migrated out of J&K. In Kashmir Valley, the most significant religious minority groups are Kashmiri Hindus or Pandits and Sikhs. These minority communities, and especially Kashmiri Pandits, have experienced heightened fear and vulnerability through war and conflict. During the last 3 decades, members of the minority Pandit community, as well as the majority Muslim community, have left Kashmir in large numbers, escaping violence and insecurity. The size of the Kashmiri Pandit community shrank from an estimated 140,000 in the late 80s to an estimated 20,000 by 1998. Scholars estimate on the basis of census data and demographic figures that 155,000 to 170,000 Kashmiri Pandits left the valley after the onset of violence in 1989. Several thousand Kashmiri Pandits have continued to live in Kashmir harmoniously with their Muslim friends and neighbors. There has never been a full and impartial accounting of what actually caused many Pandits to leave Kashmir. The scholarship shows that their departure was prompted by fear and vulnerability produced through the deterioration of the law and order situation. It's also true that serious crimes occurred against Kashmiri minority communities, including Kashmiri Pandits, in the 90s, and that these crimes have never been properly investigated or redressed, resulting in impunity and a lack of closure for victims. The Indian state, which is responsible for the security of civilians and property, utterly failed to protect Kashmiri Pandits' internationally recognized rights as minorities and victims of and refugees from an armed conflict. It is imperative to investigate all crimes against Kashmiri Pandits through an international inquiry, since Indian criminal justice processes have failed. It's also imperative that the pain and suffering of any Kashmiri community should not be instrumentalized, manipulated, or weaponized as a claim against other communities. As state subjects and as persons displaced by the conflict, Kashmiri Pandits have legal and political stakes in the future of Kashmir. The international resolution of the Kashmir dispute requires justice, truth, and a democratic and peaceful solution in keeping with international law for all Kashmiris. There's a human rights and humanitarian crisis unfolding in Kashmir, and the United States must take notice. Kashmir scholars have identified a series of recommendations for action on behalf of the people of Indian-administered Kashmir. These are included in my written testimony. We urge you to leverage your positions in the U.S. and internationally to ensure the implementation of these recommendations. And we also urge members of Congress to support a resolution calling for an end to the siege and for diplomatic support for a pathway leading to the resolution of the international dispute in accordance with the wishes of Kashmiri communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ushai? Am I pronouncing your last name right?
No, it's Ashai.
Eshai, okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. Please correct me, because I want to make sure you're identified properly. You get
Great.
you deserve
Okay,
that.
thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
Ashai. Thank you.
Eshai, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members of the Commission. My name is Stella Ashai. I've been a lawyer for about 15 years, and I've studied and published on state subjects law. Since the 1930s, before the creation of India and Pakistan as we know it, Kashmiris have been fighting for representative government and the right to decide their own future. Inevitably, these aspirations are crushed by violent state repression until one generation ages and relents and another one comes of age. In the 3 generations before me, several of my relatives have either been jailed, tortured, or killed for speaking the same truths that I am here to say to you today. So speaking openly to you about the plight of Kashmir without fearing for my life is a privilege that I do not take for granted. When Article 370 was unilaterally abrogated by the BJP-led government, I was dismayed but not surprised. The revocation of Kashmir's so-called special status has long been a target of the BJP as far back as 1953, when it was the subject of a major campaign by the BJP's predecessor party. This unilateral and unconstitutional action impacts all 12 million indigenous residents of the state, of all religions and all ethnicities, and representatives of all significant subpopulations within the state have expressed concern about this abrogation. Article 370 was intended to limit the powers of the Indian state over Jammu and Kashmir, and Article 35A enshrined a long-standing law in Kashmir that predated independent India and Pakistan, which defined state subjects, which are now called permanent residents. State subjects were to be given preferential treatment in government employment, and land ownership was to be restricted to state subjects only. India's repeated failure to abide by the constitutional provision of Article 370 from the outset has resulted in a de facto annexation of Kashmir. India achieved this by engaging in a pattern of jailing political activists until they conceded to the demands of the center, preventing free assembly of civilians, punishing journalists who published truthfully, and packing the territory with military personnel to terrorize the local population, all of which they justified by invoking the specter of national security. With the current siege and the abrogation of Article 370, India's long-standing project to unlawfully annex Kashmir is complete, and the consequences have already proven disastrous. The Indian government's position was captured neatly in an op-ed written by Ambassador Shringla in the New York Times. It's rife with factual errors, mischaracterizations of the law, and predictable complaints about Pakistan. There are mainly three arguments: development, women's rights, and LGBTQ rights, and I'll address all three. First, Article 370 has not been an impediment to development in Kashmir, and notwithstanding the heavy military occupation and the dire situation over the last many decades, the human development indicators in Kashmir are still higher than the national average, and in some cases, among the best in the nation, despite disproportionately low levels of public investment from India. These remarkable development indicators can be attributed directly to sweeping land reforms that occurred in the 1950s to dismantle the feudal system, which was only made possible by a separate constitution. To be clear, the BJP goal is not development, but demographic change and exploitation of abundant natural resources. Having failed to quell a near-century-old fight for representative government, demographic change is now the strategy. By resettling Kashmir with non-Kashmiris, it can advance its project to enshrine the Hindu identity of the nation. And analysts in the press have remarked that this mirrors Beijing's strategy of encouraging Han Chinese to move to Xinjiang, a northwestern province with Muslim ethnic groups. In fact, within days of announcing the abrogation, the federal government announced that it had prepared a development plan that would facilitate private investment, and industry would now be possible due to their new ability to buy land. This is a completely false premise, as corporations are expressly permitted to become permanent residents in Kashmir, which has been documented through an order that was published in 1927, and foreign corporations often hold land in 99-year leases. And of course, the government of India has faced no barriers in expropriating an enormous amount of land, roughly the size of my hometown in Dallas, Texas, for its own security camps and armed forces. This is land that would otherwise be used for housing, recreation, or agriculture. I welcome questions. I can delve into this in a little more detail, but I know my time is short. The next argument is that the abrogation of Article 370 is required to protect women from gender discriminatory laws. This is exactly what I published on, and the law is very clear. It's well settled. Since 2002, a high court case made it clear that Kashmiri state subject women do not lose their property rights if they marry a non-Kashmiri. And in fact, non-Kashmiri women obtain state subject status when they marry a Kashmiri man. There's also, with respect to family law, it's been argued that the issue of instant divorce could only be cured with the abrogation of Article 370. The issue of instant divorce was already remedied in detail in 2012 in a high court case when the court ruled that a husband does not have an unqualified power to pronounce divorce. Regardless, there's absolutely no evidence that instant divorce even occurs with any frequency in Kashmir. But additionally, and most importantly, revoking Article 370 to address gender discrimination in the state stands in direct contrast to the will of Kashmiri women, who alongside men have repeatedly been protesting in favor of the rights of Kashmiris to have self-determination and an end to the Indian Army's abuses in Kashmir. Finally, Article 370's revocation does absolutely nothing legally to benefit the LGBTQ community. As in the rest of India, homosexuality was decriminalized in Kashmir after Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code was held to be unconstitutional. As with all Kashmiris, the LGBT community there also wants an end to the military occupation. And as countless legal scholars have explained, the court's decision extends to all state high courts, including the High Court of Jammu and Kashmir. And there's no special law in the Jammu and Kashmir constitution that otherwise criminalizes homosexuality. India's approach to Kashmir can be summed up by an adaptation of Carl Sandburg's famous quip: if the facts are against you, argue the law. If the law is against you, argue the facts. If the law and the facts are against you, just pound the table and yell about Pakistan. But as Gandhi said, truth never damages a cause that is just. And that is why I support the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights recommendations on the human rights crisis in Kashmir, because they are concrete and actionable steps to get to the bottom to get to the bottom, to get to the truth of what has happened in Kashmir, both for the majority population and the minority. And I urge our congressmen and our congresswomen to support a resolution that calls for an end to the siege and that provides diplomatic support for a pathway that allows the people of Jammu and Kashmir to decide their own future. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Fazili?
Thanks.
Did I pronounce that right? I hope.
Perfect.
Okay, good.
Perfect.
I did one right.
Good afternoon, you guys. Thank you so much. Oh, is it not on? I'm sorry. Thanks. All right. Thanks. All right. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me and for having all of us here today. I'm submitting this testimony to document the experiences of my family and other Kashmiris since August of this year. I speak for those who are unable and afraid to come forward because they fear retribution for their family in the valley, and I speak for my cousin, Dr. Mubin Shah, who has been unjustly imprisoned by Indian authorities since August 5th, 2019. It's no exaggeration to say I would not have the privilege of being American if it had not been for Mubin's mother, Tati, who helped my father finish medical school. And my father, the youngest son of a teacher, may never have been able to afford medical school if Article 35A, which Stella talked about, had not been in place. My cousin Mubin is being made an example of. His imprisonment sends a strong message to the people of Kashmir that money, family, and status mean nothing in the face of Indian capriciousness. There's a climate of fear in Kashmir. Since August, armed forces conduct night raids on homes and are pulling young men and boys straight from their beds into military custody. My cousin was taken in a midnight raid such as that. He's not a politician, he's not a dissident, he's not a freedom fighter, he's not even a kid in a street throwing stones, he's just a businessman. His life work has focused on bringing economic opportunity to Kashmir. He's in his 60s and has several severe health issues. Most urgently, he suffers from drug-resistant chronic UTIs, which require surgical intervention. Despite numerous appeals to state officials and the Indian court system, he remains without access to surgery, and each day the risk for uncontrolled septicemia, which, if left untreated, could be fatal, grows greater. Around midnight on August 5th, my cousin and his wife were awakened by dozens of police and armed military personnel raiding their home. An officer told him he was under arrest. His wife, Asifa, was stunned and terrified. Did they have a warrant? What was the reason for this arrest? Believing this would be a brief interrogation, Mubin didn't even take medicine with him. Mind you, that day, there wasn't just a communications blackout. There was almost no movement in the streets. Almost overnight, the military occupation of Kashmir intensified. Roads were cordoned off with barbed wire. The streets were eerily silent. Military personnel lined every block, carrying huge loaded guns. These were the streets Asifa had to navigate. Even journalists were not allowed to move about freely. Mubin and Asifa had no way of knowing that this was the start of one of the biggest mass arrests of civilians in India in decades. And Haley touched upon the fact that government sources admit to 4,000 arrests, but human rights advocates believe the number is much, much higher. And these are just regular people. They're civilians. They're not accused of terrorism. They're regular people. Here on this side of the Atlantic, it took more than 4 days to learn about my cousin's arrest due to the communications blackout. In a panic, my sister and I called our friends at the State Department and were put in touch with wonderful people at the U.S. Embassy in India, but their hands were tied. Later, we learned that Mubin was flown 600 miles away from Kashmir to Agra's central jail. It took over a month for his wife to be allowed to see him. We've tried to appeal within the Indian legal system for some relief, but none has been granted. Our Indian attorneys thought we had a strong case, but when it comes to Kashmiris, India has never acted with justice and fairness, and the regular rule of law is often suspended. The Indian government contends that he is being detained under a Public Safety Act, PSA, which affords zero due process and allows for up to 2 years of detention without charges. In fact, Amnesty International called the PSA a lawless law. Despite all this, Asifa knows she's one of the lucky ones. She has the resources to travel to Agra. She has the luxury that literally thousands of Kashmiris don't have. For example, there was young 18-year-old Hussein, and just for the purpose of protecting families and identities, the names have been changed. Hussein is a pellet victim. He was wounded by Indian soldiers and has already underwent 3 eye surgeries. 4 years ago, when he was only 14, he was severely beaten by police, resulting in lasting leg injuries. Hussein's a simple roadside vendor. He isn't a rabble-rouser. He isn't a loudmouth. He isn't even political. He's just a kid who tried to be a regular kid. And since August 17th, he's been imprisoned far away in Varanasi jail under the PSA. He only speaks Kashmiri, and he can't communicate with anybody, and his family is too poor to even visit him. There's also Faisal, a 25-year-old who suffers seizures and has bipolar disorder. Since 2016, he has been arrested and tortured under the PSA several times. When he was rounded up on August 5th, he was out buying medicine for his mother, and now he is far away in jail in UP. These are stories of the living, even if they are in prison without a just cause and with no end in sight. But there are so many tales of the dead that I shudder just to think of them. This August, 17-year-old Omar was being chased and beaten by Indian military forces, CRPF. Terrified and trying to save himself and escape, he ran into a river, but he didn't know how to swim. So he grabbed onto a reed to stay afloat. A CRPF member followed him into the river and beat his hands so he would let go of the reed and drown. And once he slipped beneath the waters, they left. And as soon as he left, local boys jumped in and they fished him out. He was still alive, but barely. On the way to the hospital, he passed away. And when he got to the hospital, doctors refused to issue the family a death certificate. And this is just kind of a classic example of the intense pressure health officials have been under to support a narrative that no Kashmiris have died as a result of India's actions since August 5th. And as if the family hadn't suffered enough, the military fired tear gas and pepper spray at the burial and even fired bullets, which ended up injuring 2 people. So we know in our family that we're lucky. Our cousin is alive, and sure, he might not have clean clothes or improper access to medical care, but he's alive, and for that, my whole family is so thankful. The Indian government has claimed, like Salah also had touched upon, that it removed Kashmir's autonomy to promote economic development in the region. My cousin's arrest proves just how disingenuous the BJP government's claims are. Mobeen was a tireless advocate for achieving peace in the region through economic development and trade. In fact, he is the former president of the Kashmiri Chamber of Commerce. He's a voice of moderation, peace, and economic progress in Kashmir. It's hard to believe India has the audacity to refer to itself as the world's largest democracy when it essentially has kept Kashmir under martial law for decades and allows its military to operate with great impunity. What democratic rights there are in Kashmir, with no freedom of speech, no due process, and no freedom of assembly. For the last 4 months, all Kashmiris have lived under some form of house arrest. Everyone feels trapped in their homes. Like a deer in perpetual headlights, Kashmiris feel paralyzed. With so much military patrolling the streets, people are afraid. They're afraid to even go out for groceries, worried that that trip will be their last. With no internet service, people feel cut off from the world. I hope that Congress is able to put pressure on India to release detainees, or at a minimum, to provide basic human rights and health care to detainees like my cousin. I also hope you're able to become an advocate for all the people of Kashmir. Kashmir is not just a strategic place in the great powers game in South Asia. It's a home with families and people who for far too long have lived lives of generational suffering. As an American, I hope you can become a voice for true democracy in the region and for the Kashmiri people to be given a choice in deciding their own history and future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sethi?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
2019 marks the 100th anniversary of one of the great atrocities of colonial rule in South Asia. On April 13, 1919, British officers opened fire on civilians in Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, Punjab, murdering more than 1,000 people. Soon after, the British enforced an ordinance that compelled Indians to crawl the streets so that they knew their place in the colonial hierarchy. In 1947, India created a constitutional republic based on the principles of secularism and pluralism. The founders hoped this framework would hold the nation's rich diversity together and ensure that India would never inflict on others the brutality inflicted on them. Yet today, Hindu nationalist mobs roam India, targeting Muslims, Dalits, and Christians, sometimes forcing them to recite Hindu slogans. Security forces have forced Kashmiris to lick dirt off the road for refusing to utter national mottos. Hindu nationalism isn't new to India, but it is on the rise. It's rooted in the belief that India is a Hindu nation and that Hindus, who make up 80% of the population, should enjoy a privileged status and exercise majoritarian rule. This ideology is amplified by the RSS, a male-only volunteer paramilitary organization. Its earliest leaders referred to Christians and Muslims as, quote, internal threats, and compared India's Muslims to, quote, Jews in Germany. The BJP is the political wing of the RSS, and Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, its national leader. Modi himself trained with the RSS at the age of 8 and recently told a crowd of RSS supporters that he was proud to be a member. Amit Shah, Modi's second in command, has called undocumented Muslim immigrants, quote, termites, and vowed, quote, to throw them in the Bay of Bengal. Modi today is forging a new India, where non-Hindus are second-class subjects with limited rights. India is often called the world's largest democracy, but democracies only work if people can speak, associate, and protest freely. Democracies only thrive if they safeguard civil liberties and minority rights. Today, India more closely resembles an authoritarian regime than a pluralistic republic. On August 5th, India revoked the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir without legal foundation or consultation with the people. Security forces have arrested thousands of Kashmiris, including children as young as 9, without cause. Family members fear that security forces may disappear their loved ones and dump their bodies in mass graves. Detainees who have been released have alleged brutal torture. The government has simultaneously imposed a curfew and communication blockade on the region. The internet and many phone lines remain cut off. UN experts call it collective punishment and inconsistent with the fundamental norms of necessity and proportionality. Modi is also pursuing a strategy of forced displacement in Assam, one of India's most diverse states. In August, the government published a list that excluded 1.9 million people that it claims did not have the paperwork to prove their citizenship. Unsurprisingly, many are Muslims, women, children, and the impoverished. Those excluded have to prove their citizenship in one of 200 newly created foreigner tribunals, and if they fail, may be sent to detention camps. While a large number of Bengali Hindus are affected, they will fare better in the tribunals, which have shown anti-Muslim bias. Muslims, Dalits, Christians, Sikhs, journalists, and human rights activists are all vulnerable to violence in India. A recent study found that 90% of religious hate crimes between the years 2009 and 2018 occurred under Modi's watch. Another report found that between May 2015 and December 2018, at least 44 people were killed by cow vigilantes. In India today, lynchings are so commonplace that they are often organized on social media and the videos uploaded online for the world to see. Rarely does the government hold the perpetrators accountable. Last summer, a cabinet minister garlanded 8 men who had been convicted of lynching a Muslim, and Modi himself seldom acknowledges the hate spreading across India. Yet, as its October hate crimes report shows, India is eager to publish information about attacks committed by, quote, anti-national elements and jihadi terrorists, while excluding data on religious violence and crimes against journalists. In India today, the government can unilaterally declare a person a terrorist without due process and incarcerate activists under false charges and arbitrary laws. Government bodies have rewritten history books by removing sections on Muslims and dropped Muslim names from historical sites. The war on civil society and dissent has reached a frenzied pace in recent months. Professors have been asked to furnish credentials for speaking out, and just recently, an author was stripped of overseas citizenship for criticizing Modi. There is little redress for those who suffer human rights violations as impunity reigns. There is yet to be accountability for the 2002 Gujarat massacres, during which mobs slaughtered 2,000 Muslims and displaced thousands. And 35 years after the anti-Sikh pogroms of 1984, in which mobs murdered 17,000 Sikhs across 40 cities, with the support of the police and Congress Party, survivors are still seeking justice. These massacres were followed by over a decade of gross violations in Punjab, including torture, unlawful killings, and enforced disappearances of Sikhs. I work closely with South Asian minority communities in the US, and they fear they are at risk too. Hindu nationalism has found its way abroad, from the rewriting of textbooks in California to influencing elections overseas, and as reported just yesterday, to the creation of 265 fake news outlets that amplify Indian interests and target its opponents. Many fear for the safety of their friends and family back home and worry that the long arm of the Indian state will punish them for speaking out. I fear that my testimony today and that of others speaking here and at rallies around the world may be grounds for being banned from India. Congress must meet with their constituents from Indian minority communities and investigate Hindu nationalism, the RSS, and their influence in the US. Lawmakers must demand that India allow legal observers and foreign journalists unfettered access into Kashmir, Assam, and across India, prosecute those responsible for atrocities, and provide reparations. Vulnerable communities across India deserve justice.
Thank you. Ms. Vashisht, did I pronounce that?
Yes.
Good. I'm doing better.
That's perfectly all right.
Thank you. Well, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for inviting me to testify here as a witness today. It's worth remembering that this commission is named after the late Congressman Tom Lantos, a Hungarian-born Holocaust survivor. In July 2003, he said, "Indians and Jews share a passionate commitment to respect for others, for the rule of law, and for the mindless, vicious, fanatic Islamic terrorism." I'm also reminded today of American journalist Daniel Pearl, who was kidnapped and beheaded by Pakistani terrorists. His last words, "My father is a Jewish, my mother is a Jewish, I am a Jewish." Honorable members of the Tom Lantos Commission, I speak before you the last words of Daniel Pearl in my own words. My father is a Kashmiri Hindu, my mother is a Kashmiri Hindu, I am a Kashmiri Hindu, and our home and lives in Kashmir were destroyed by radical Islamic terrorism. As I begin to speak, I am choked. As I begin to speak, I'm choked by the thoughts of those voices I represent here, because their voices were extinguished in the most brutal fashion. I am a member of the minority Hindu community from Kashmir, victim of the worst ethnic cleansing witnessed in independent India. I speak here today because I am a survivor. An innocent young woman, a lab assistant in a school, wasn't as lucky as I was. She was abducted, blindfolded, gang raped, and cut into two halves on a mechanical saw while still alive. Her name was Girija Tikku. Her only crime, her faith. I am her voice today. I am also the voice of young Kashmiri Hindu engineer who was hunted by terrorists, again for his faith. When terrorists came to kill him, he hid inside a rice container in his attic, and he would have been alive today had his location not been disclosed to the terrorists by his own neighbors. His neighbors he trusted, neighbors that we trusted. The terrorists shot him through the container and forced his wife to eat the blood-soaked rice. His name was B.K. Ganju. His crime, his faith. I speak for him today. I could go on and on. We have seen ISIS level of horror and brutality in Kashmir 30 years before the West was even introduced to the brutalities of radical Islamic terror. I'm glad these hearings are happening today, because when my family and I lost our homes, our livelihood, and our way of life, the world remained silent. Where were the advocates of human rights when my rights were taken away? Where were they on the night of 19th January 1990, when there were voices blaring from all mosques in Kashmir that they wanted Kashmir with Hindu women but without Hindu men? Where were the saviors of humanity when my feeble old grandfather stood with 2 kitchen knives and an old rusted axe, ready to kill my mother and I in order to save us from the much worse fate that awaited us if we landed in the hands of terrorists on the same fateful night? My people were given 3 choices: flee, convert, or die. Around 400,000 Kashmiri Hindus fled right after that night of horror. They survived. Those who didn't were killed. Today, 30 years later, I'm still not welcome in my home in Kashmir. I am not allowed to follow my faith without fear. My house in Kashmir is illegally occupied, as those of other countless others in my community. Those that are not occupied have mostly been burned down or are ransacked. Thousands of our temples have been vandalized, desecrated, and lay in ruins. Every effort has been made to eradicate Hinduism from Kashmir. Today, Kashmir is home to only one religion. This is by design and is the ultimate violation of human rights. Diversity and acceptance of different views are not the norm in today's Kashmir. It's not just Hindus that have been ethnically cleansed. Sikhs have been massacred. A fatwa was announced against Christian schools in Kashmir, accusing them of luring Muslims to Christianity. What human rights are we talking about when all minorities have either been driven out or silenced? An Islamist state of Kashmir where other religions are not welcome and tolerance of any other viewpoint is absent is no citadel of human rights. This is the society that is being created by Kashmir by those who are talking about human rights. Terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, is the ultimate opponent of human rights. Human rights cannot and should not take precedence over human life. Everyone who stands for freedom, liberty, and right to life should worry about radicalization that fuels terror. A 65-year-old shopkeeper, Ghulam Muhammad Mir, gets killed by the terrorists because he opened his shop to earn his livelihood. Truck drivers and apple traders are shot dead by terrorists for simply wanting to earn their livelihood. The simple act of earning livelihood in Kashmir today is prohibited by terrorists because earning a livelihood would show that Kashmir is moving towards normalcy. I ask you, who are these people who fear normalcy in Kashmir? Who are these people who talk about human rights but fear free movement, free thought, and right to earn livelihood? Abrogation of Article 370, that has raised so much concern around the world, is in fact a restoration of human rights. Indian Constitution, which is modeled on the US Constitution, Indian Constitution,
Excuse me, everybody.
Indian Constitution, which is modeled on the...
I want to say, just, I mean, we want to give everybody the respect of listening to them, so I would urge that nobody interrupt.
Thank you so much,
All right.
Chairman. I was saying that Indian Constitution, which is modeled on the US Constitution, is the most liberal document in the world. The Constitution was not applicable to J&K in totality as long as Article 370 was in force. After abrogation of Article 370, people of Jammu and Ladakh have been liberated from the tyranny of being half citizens in their own country. Child marriage, which was responsible for child trafficking and sex trafficking, has been made illegal in Kashmir. Kashmiri women and LGBTQ community in Kashmir has been given the same rights as other Indian citizens. As a mother, it's very important to me now that child marriage has been outlawed in Kashmir. Today, I'm delighted that Kashmiris have the same rights as Indian citizens. If something as serious as women's right to own property and granting of LGBTQ rights to choose, amongst many others, has been accomplished through abrogation of Article 370, then it's safe to assume that restoration of internet in few remaining districts of Kashmir is not too far away. I am a proud daughter of Kashmir. I am a proud legatee of India's composite civilization. Terrorism has uprooted me and snatched my home from me. I hope my human rights are restored too someday, and the human rights of my community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to John Sifton for any comments he may have. Welcome back.
Thank you. And
Hey,
thank you
make sure
for,
your microphone is on, that's all.
it's on, sorry, loud enough? Thank you for inviting me to testify. I mean, human rights under threat in the province of Jammu and Kashmir, but they're also under threat in India more generally, and I think that's been made clear by some of the testimony. And the Lantos Commission deserves praise for recognizing that it's not just about Kashmir, that there are broader issues across India that should be discussed if you're going to talk about Kashmir. The written part of my testimony is much longer. It's on our website. It goes into a lot of the issues that have already been discussed. I'd ask to be put in the record. But I'm just going to focus on one particular part of my testimony where we talk about the Indian government's response to a lot of the concerns that have been raised about what's happened in Kashmir in particular since August. Now, it's been very clear that they've largely dismissed the international attention that's come from the United Nations and from others as a, quote, false and motivated narrative that, quote, ignored the core issue of cross-border terrorism. Now, this is something we can all agree on. There is a legitimate security concern about militant groups operating in Jammu and Kashmir, and Pakistan has supported militant groups and has carried out attacks. And let's dispel that issue that human rights groups and the UN have not reported on those abuses. We have for years. Our first report was in 1990, 92, 94, 99, 2001, and 2006. This 158-page report on Jammu and Kashmir talks about abuses by militants reported by Pakistan, as well as abuses by the Indian government. So I just wanted to dispel that as an issue. As I said, Pakistan has supported militant groups that have carried out attacks, but this does not absolve, and this is the crux of the issue, this does not absolve Indian authorities of holding to account security forces that are responsible for serious violations themselves. India has advanced this narrative that the main purpose in revoking Kashmir's autonomous state, which was a long-time goal of the BJP, was economic development, and we've discussed the New York Times op-ed. So far, though, we really haven't seen many actions by the government that suggest that that narrative is truthful. The government's focusing of all the blame for the past economic problems, security problems, everything else on outside factors, cross-border militant groups, Pakistan's support for them, ignores the government's abuse and rights-violating tactics, which has increased support for militant groups in Kashmir. In other words, India has absolved itself of blame by blaming everything on Pakistan and militants supported by them. And that's the crux of the problem. Until the Indian government acknowledges and addresses how their own abuses have fueled this situation, along with the abuses and actions of Pakistan, all these problems are going to endure. All of them are going to endure. And this is where I think Congress can act. While encouraging Pakistan to end their support for militant groups that commit abuses in Kashmir, members of Congress should communicate to the Indian government that their actions in Kashmir are adding to the region's human rights problems. Members of Congress can challenge Indian officials to re-examine their policies, re-examine their practices in Kashmir. And U.S. officials can insist that political leaders and all the others who have been arbitrarily detained are released, and that the restrictions on communication are lifted. And then you can do all these recommendations that we've made. That's what Congress can do. And linking these to the larger issues, which I address in my testimony, I think is a good way to do that. Because to riff off the cliche phrasing about the world's oldest democracy, we should having the world's oldest democracy speaking to members of the largest democracy as colleagues in a democratic tradition, voicing their concerns about common threats that face democracies around the world, including this one. Overwrought nationalism that demonizes minorities or critics or journalists, xenophobic rhetoric, and the relentless blaming of outsiders. Now, last issue I want to, and the written testimony goes on, I hope it's introduced into the record, but to address something that Representative Lee and Representative Jayapal asked about information coming out, and the last witness in the previous panel had spoken about how not a lot of information is coming out. Now, I agree that we need to open it up. They need to let in journalists, let in diplomats, let in the UN. I'll get to that. But it's not true that no information is coming out. Information is coming out. So we can't let the Indian narrative of you don't know what's going on because you don't know what's going on gain the upper hand. We do know what's going on. We know that thousands were detained in August, and somewhere around 1,000 remain detained. We know the government failed to articulate a legal justification in most cases for that detention. We know the internet is not available. We know that the mobile service that is restored doesn't carry data, so you can't have web-based apps or anything like that. At most, you can make a telephone call, and often you can't. But we know, more importantly, that because of that, as a result of all that, people can't do a lot of things. They can't email, and business people can't send orders or invoices and send money if they need a web-based app to do that. A doctor can't send an X-ray as an attachment to an email because he can't send emails. So this broad internet blackout is having extraordinary effects not just on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, but on freedom of health, freedom of work, freedom to be educated. All of the rights that are articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or almost all of them, are affected by this internet blackout because the internet is such a component part of how humans live in this day. And lastly, we know that cases have been filed in the Supreme Court challenging all of this, challenging the revocation of the status, challenging the internet ban. We know that habeas cases have been filed in the High Court in Jammu and Kashmir, and other cases in the Supreme Court challenging the authority for the detention. And we know that quite likely there are cases pending that raise the detention of so many of the people who were arrested in August. Last thing I wanted to say was that earlier the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights report was mentioned and the recommendations in it. Rather than exhaust you with more of me talking or anything like that, I would just recommend that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights report from earlier this summer before August lays out as a set of recommendations pretty much everything that I think a lot of us, not all of us, agree India needs to do. And I'm just going to focus on 4 of the many ones. They're all in there. Obviously, allowing journalists and human rights researchers and diplomats and the United Nations, their special rapporteurs and their high commissioner staff into the country, as well as USURF, the previous panel, into Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, is a key recommendation because it opens the transparency about what's going on. It's very important to prevent abuses and stop future abuse. But then the other ones are legal, the other of the many ones in the report. And one is the repeal of the PSA, which is this highly problematic law that India just has to get rid of. And then lastly, the repeal of a law that has been not discussed as much on this panel, which is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which remains this law that essentially gives effective immunity to the Indian military in Jammu and Kashmir. Basically, to put it in a nutshell, you can't prosecute an Indian government personnel, military personnel without their permission, which effectively gives the military veto power over any investigation or effort to hold people accountable for any type of abuse, not even a minor abuse. So until this law is scrapped or overruled as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, you're going to have the impunity, which again, to go back to the reports that I mentioned that we wrote in 1989 and 90 and 92, has been the feature all along. The impunity that allows the forces to continue committing abuses in this region and in others, and which fuels the militancy. Again, not blaming India alone. Pakistan is to blame, and the militant groups that they are supporting. But the impunity and the abuses are also fueling the conflict. And until India comes to terms with that, we're going to see this just keep going on. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you all for your very strong and passionate statements. And I think it also highlights, some of the challenges that we face, because there isn't unanimity on all the basic facts, and everybody has their own perspective here, and I certainly appreciate that. But I'm wondering whether there are some things that we could all agree on, that I think could help mightily in, and maybe addressing some of the concerns that were raised here. For example, I mean, Mr. Sif, I mentioned this opening my statement. Mr. Sifter just mentioned again. I mean, do we all agree that journalists and independent human rights observers should be allowed into Kashmir? Is there? I mean, yeah, okay, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I'm sorry.
True.
Journalists are already allowed. How are all the reports coming here? How are
That's
people
not
reading
true.
the news?
That's absolutely
How
not
are all
true.
the reports coming here?
Well,
Foreign journalists are not allowed,
Right, well,
but
foreign, yeah,
NY
well,
journalists are allowed.
okay, well,
Only
Well, I mean,
state-run
That's
media
not true. That's not true.
Well, I
A
mean,
lot
maybe-
of critical reports have been coming out.
That's
The critical
100%
reports
not
would
true.
not-
It's only state-run
100%
media
critical-
journalists. It's not
100%
independent
critical
journalists.
reports have
You're
been written.
totally wrong.
I don't have a gavel here, but I have a pen. But I guess maybe I should add the word international journalists and observers,
Yes.
whether they should be allowed
Thank
to
you.
come in.
Thank you.
No.
Indian journalists are allowed.
Yeah, right. I mean, does anybody have an objection if international journalists and independent human rights organizations were let into Kashmir?
We'd love that.
Yeah.
The UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, David Kay, made a request last year to visit the country and Jammu and Kashmir. He also made a request to visit Pakistan. Both countries have denied him. Both countries should let him in.
Right. So, I mean,
Who is going to be responsible for the safety of international journalists when they go to Kashmir?
well, you know what? I mean, I think international.
Who is going to be responsible?
You should ask international journalists.
Right,
International
absolutely,
journalists go to Syria.
Right.
They go across the world. It's on them.
Yeah.
And so I very much trust
I think-
international journalists and their institutions to protect
So
their
I
safety.
think I think we're all in agreement that international journalists should be allowed in. We all in agreement that the UN should be allowed in?
Yes.
All right. So, all right, there's agreement on two things right there. Because I think that would go a long way in helping clarify some of the basic issues, number one. Number two, I mean, you know, Ms. Jackson-Lee mentioned this earlier, and I mentioned it when I spoke. I mean, I represent a vibrant Indian American community. I represent a vibrant Pakistani American community. And we have constituents that are concerned about their relatives, you know, who are in Kashmir. And, you know, could we all agree that the remaining restrictions on the internet and other forms of communication should be lifted? I mean,
Yes,
that
yes,
is a,
100%.
I mean, so is it, I mean, so is it, I mean, I think those are two issues that are, you know, somewhat contentious right now that we're all in agreement on. I mean, because the bottom line is, you know, I mean, again, in my district, I mean, I mean, some of the most compassionate and you know, magnanimous and wonderful people fall into these communities, and I mean, the most tolerant are in my district. I'm sure Sheila will say the same thing about the Indian American and Pakistani American communities in her district. And you know, and but you know what? But there is dispute over basic facts, and I think, you know, allowing international journalists, allowing the UN, allowing independent human rights organizations to go in, I think that helps, you know, helps clarify things in a way that people have confidence in what everybody is saying. You know, this is for Haley or John. I mean, for the record, I mean, can you please remind us of the obligations under international law that India and Pakistan have to victims of human rights violations who are under their jurisdiction, including victims of forced displacement?
Okay, I'll go first.
Yeah.
Well, first on freedom of expression, because it's actually shouldn't really be controversial. A government, excuse me, cannot derogate from the freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, so broadly and open-endedly and for so long. It's just simply indefensible under international human rights law. And don't take my word for it, take their word for it. The Human Rights Committee that enforces the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has a very clear article, a very clear general comment about how freedom of expression works that makes it very clear that when you do a kill switch approach where you shut off mobile data, even if you leave the phones on, if you cut off the internet in that way, you are violating international human rights law. So it's just not a question here. You can impose short-time shutdowns in certain circumstances. You can narrowly tailor restrictions. You can do a lot of things, but you can't do what they've done. So I wanted to be clear about that. As far as detention goes, you know, it's a standard principle of international human rights law that you can't detain somebody without due process, except in wartime, which is not applicable here. The international humanitarian law, the laws of war, do not apply for the ordinary situations in Jammu and Kashmir. So and even if they did, there are rules about that too. You cannot just simply detain so many people without bringing them before a court and explaining the circumstances and the legal justifications of their detention. And I think those are the two most important principles in place here. I mentioned, of course, that a lot of other human rights principles get affected by the restrictions, from the right to health to on, but those are the two pillars of what needs to be addressed right now.
Dr. Dushinsky, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just make two quick comments. First of all, I'll just make the comment that these kinds of cycles of arbitrary and undocumented and illegal detention, also cycling through with preventive detention that we're seeing really escalating during this current period of crisis. These actually aren't new or recent developments in Kashmir, and this has been the way that the criminal justice system has been operating in Kashmir for some time. So it's been an issue of like longstanding concern for human rights activists and for scholars in the area. And also just on the topic of the scope of India's international obligations, India has not ratified the Convention Against Torture or the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. This is something that has come up in India's last 3 Universal Periodic Reviews. Its next UPR is coming up in a couple of years. And the failure of India to participate in the international human rights system in all of these different ways really does compromise India's bid, which it's been explicit about since 1994, to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and also kind of undermines its position currently as a member state on the Human Rights Council.
Yeah, I'm gonna have some more questions, but I know my colleague Sheila Jackson Lee's been waiting patiently here. But before I yield to her, I do. Mr. Sifton said something that I think I always try to say. You know, when we're doing human rights hearings in this commission, and that is, you know, when we talk about human rights, you know, especially members of Congress, we need to remind ourselves it isn't always about somebody else. I mean, in our own country, it has been engaged in practices over the years that, quite frankly, deserve to be condemned, and sometimes we were slow in condemning them. And I think you know, but having said that, I mean, part of our job, and I think all of our jobs here, is to constantly be asking us and others to do better. I mean, I believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and every time my government behaves in a way that I think undermines that, I feel sad. I feel like we've let our citizens down and we've let the world down. And when I think of, you know, what's happening, you know, in the areas that we're talking about here today, you know, I think we all, you know, genuinely, you know, are grateful to the many contributions of Pakistan and India, and there's so much that we admire and respect, and yet, you know, when we talk about some of the cases that have been mentioned here today, it's disheartening, and we need to figure out how we move on, and not just kind of dig in on either side. I mean, there has to be some common ground. When I was in college, I worked for George McGovern, no relation. He had a great last name. Yes. But you know, one of the things he always used to say is you don't have to agree on everything to agree on something.
Right.
And we got to find those somethings. And it seems like we all agree that, you know, international observers and international journalists should be able to come in and see these areas. And I think that's, you know, that's important, and that the restrictions on the internet and other forms of communication should be lifted. That would go a long way to easing the concerns that a lot of our constituents have who can't get a hold of their loved ones. And those seem like those aren't huge asks, but they seem to be reasonable, and I think they can help move us maybe in a direction where we can find even more to agree on. But let me yield to my colleague from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee.
Chairman, thank you so very much. And let me echo, first of all, I note that Tom Lantos was quoted and or noted, and I have been on this commission during the lifetime of Tom Lantos. And so I know the spirit, as my colleague, Ms. McGovern, as well. I know that his spirit is one that wants to seek not the word compromise, but wants to seek the pathway forward and the decency to respect the views of the many people that are in this room. But I echo the words of Mr. McGovern in the vibrancy of Pakistani community and the Indian community in our respective territories. And it is always tough when you are drawn to ignore one side or the other. But what I will say is not only for journalists and human rights groups that would be able to respond to the facts that have been put forward, none of which I will deny. Because I have family members who have indicated, why do you want to insist that the internet be blocked? Why do you not provide information about people who are in fact ill or cannot get word back to their loved ones? Why would you want that to be the case? You wouldn't want that to be the case from New York to LA to Houston to Chicago and beyond. As a person in an African American skin, it would be living in what is, in many instances, an imperfect America, but an America that has the best values of any nation around, to immediately have a fiat and say that no African American can ever vote again in the United States in 2019. And so it is on the basis of who I am. If there is a pathway to do the basics, why not do the basics? And might I add, why not allow members of the United States Congress to visit both parts of Jammu and Kashmir? A visit that I intend and want to do. So let me just ask this question. I'm going to ask it of the two individuals sitting right next to each other. And I want to thank you for your testimony. I would like to, and let us not forget that the comments have been around all religious minorities. And I think that all of us who are here in this country, who live alongside of different religious minorities and others, and give them the respect that they deserve. I just was in the midst of burying an outstanding deputy sheriff, Sadim Diwali, in Houston, Texas. We mourned him. He was not my faith, but his spirit and his actions and his love of all the community deserved our respect. And so to you, Mr. Sethi, give me one pathway forward in where we are today.
For me, the pathway forward must be rooted in human rights. So there are certain human rights, as has been mentioned today, that are non-derogable, including, for example, the right to be free from torture. And yet we know today from international journalists who have gone into Kashmir, from local journalists, from community activists, that children are being tortured in Kashmir. So that's the first principle, right? Certain human rights are sacrosanct.
Who are the actors that are doing that?
Indian armed forces. Indian armed forces are torturing children in Kashmir today, right? And there is plenty of evidence that I would be happy to submit as a appendix to my testimony today. Second, we need to understand that another principle of human rights law is that collective punishment, right, is something that we can never tolerate. And so when you look at the communication blackout, right, when you look at something like the PSA, the Public Safety Act, right, these are forms of collective punishment. They don't require any type of due process. They don't require any type of cause, right? These are at-large mass attempts to silence an entire community, including, for example, Sikhs, right? So I want to be very clear here. My colleague mentioned the plight of Sikhs in Kashmir. I will tell you, I know Sikhs in Kashmir. I know Sikhs who are part of the diaspora here in the United States. They are in favor of self-determination in Kashmir. They are against...
After the massacre of Chatti Singhpura,
Madam, I will give you an opportunity. And I'd appreciate if you'd wrap up the pathway
absolutely.
forward. I got the human rights.
Yeah, so non-derogable, no collective punishment. And then finally, understanding that any imposition into civil and human rights must be necessary and proportionate, right? So I think there are a few core principles of human rights law that India has in large scale abandoned, and that's why we're in the situation we are today.
Let me thank you, and Ms. Bashish, thank you so very much. I was almost there. Thank you.
Almost.
Would you give us your path forward? And let me just say this as I ask your question, ask you to answer. And, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to put in letters that I have submitted to President Trump, Secretary Pompeo on this very issue, and to Prime Minister Modi.
Without
I would
objection.
ask that you would do so. Let me, as I indicate that I have also, as the co-chair, founder of the Pakistan Caucus and a member of the Indian Caucus, I have spoken as well to leaders in Pakistan. The issue, before you even speak, as we're speaking around it, that the power of Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, is mighty. You are a powerful contingent. And that means that rather than walk away, there should be encouragement for these two distinctive and recent, one re-elected, one elected heads of state to engage. And I understand that the Prime Minister of Pakistan was interested in engaging. So I'm going to put that on the table because that's something, the pathway forward in the exercise of human rights. Who can say that? And then I would say to my friends, I do not doubt that there are terrorists, but we cannot take, no one condones that. I will stand against that at every moment. We don't condone that. But we can't take the broad brush and say that that now disallows us from speaking about human rights in 2019. So what is your path forward?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. It breaks my heart that my colleague talks about Sikhs but did not mention Chitti Singhpura massacre. That was the massacre that happened around the time President Clinton visited India. 35 Sikhs, if I were massacred. Why did he not mention that? You know why? Because that would go against his agenda. That is why he did not mention that. I do not think there is any evidence available that Sikhs are looking for self-determination outside of Indian constitution. I travel to India all the time. I talk to Sikhs all the time. I talk to other minorities in Kashmir. None of them have indicated to me that they are looking for self-determination.
Let me say that is in dispute, and would you give me a path forward, please?
Yes. The path forward is we are dealing with Islamist terror in Kashmir. We have to be cognizant of this fact. Why is it that nobody on this panel except me talked about Islamist terror? Is Islamist terror a figment of my imagination?
Well,
no, it isn't. How many people have been killed by terrorists? Since August 5, not one person has been killed by security forces. All deaths have happened because of the terrorists trained by Pakistan. Why is it that nobody has mentioned this?
We have mentioned,
this double-speak, Congresswoman, this double-speak is not helping India when they are combating terrorists.
But you are on the record, and you're speaking about it, and we're giving you the forum. So it is in the record.
Thank you. But it's such a lopsided panel, but I'm thankful.
You should take heart of that. Let me do this before my time is yielded. Let me can you give me a sentence of a path forward, please?
The sentence of the path forward is we have to assist India in eradicating Islamist terror, radical Islamist terror. That is when the human rights situation will be possible. India has the greatest example of Punjab, where they dealt with Pakistani bred terror
thank you, Madam. Mr. McGovern, just
yes.
one moment. I thank you so very much, Madam. As a member of the Homeland Security Committee, we have been dealing with the idea of or the issue of terrorists for a very long time. I have come to understand, however, that to label a country with the acts of those who no one agrees with is a dangerous phenomenon. So I think the path forward...
But we cannot deny that Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan. Can we deny that?
I think the path forward should be that all of us are against terrorists, and we stand with you, and we stand with those who want the human rights dignity. I do not deny you, and I cannot deny them.
Thank you. Thank you,
Congressman.
Congressman.
One word from this gentleman here, Mr. Sifton, and you have heard two individuals, and let me thank you to the panelists. I am not ignoring you at all. Thank you for your work. I'll be reading it extensively. But could you, in your sort of, not middle of the ground, but your sort of holistic view of this, you've heard some perspectives, give us, you said it before, but give us your singular path forward. I will not abandon the question of the treatment of individuals in this region. It is evident that something is going awry, but I will not abandon the idea that we must work together, that there be tranquility amongst all. What is your path forward, please?
It's to have Congress engage with both the government of India and the government of Pakistan about both their conduct that inflames the situation and the conduct that they can take to uninflame the situation. And the really problematic and tiresome dynamic that is making this all go around in circles over and over, decade in and decade out, are the arguments that all the blame lies on one side or the other, because that makes it so that neither side is able to take actions that they themselves could take, that are in their power to take to diffuse the situation. So while it's great for a country to try to eradicate Islamic terrorism, and that goes for Pakistan too, that's not the whole story. They also have to respect human rights. Otherwise, they will be undermining that very goal.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I would just, I didn't know if you heard me on the letters that I wanted to
Yes, I
submit.
said without objection.
All right, and the only thing that I would say in conclusion, I think, Mr. Sifton, if we could do something as a commission to send a joint letter on that very point, that we need more energy at the level of the State Department, at the highest level, the Secretary. I'd asked him before. I do think with two powerful nations that we have engaged in for more than half a century, that it is, my good friend Chairman Smith is here in the room, and I know he'll have some comments, but I think it'll be important that we try to engage at that level for action to be taken place, to save lives and to promote human rights in the name of Tom Lantos. I yield back.
Yeah, and thank you, Ms. Fisher. I appreciate your passion, but I do want to say for the record that others had brought up the issue of terrorism too, including Mr. Sifton, who followed you, and because it is, I think it is something we are all concerned about, even here in the United States. I mean, in the name of stopping terrorism, we have trampled on human rights of a number of individuals, and we have come to regret it, and we've called it out. And I think that's kind of the point. No one is arguing that India can't defend itself or that we shouldn't be doing all we can to eliminate the threat of terrorism. It is making sure that we don't take away other people's rights or don't trample on other human rights in the process. And I think that's the balance. But I want to yield now to the co-chair of this commission, my good friend Chris Smith from New Jersey.
And to everyone, I apologize for being late. I'm the former chairman and now ranking member of Africa Global Health, Global Human Rights, and at 2 o'clock we had a hearing on the Sahel and the enormous challenges there, both from a humanitarian point of view, diseases, including malaria, militant, radical Islamic organizations that are wreaking havoc against innocent people. So that precluded my being here, but I want to say I apologize. I will read the record, and I know it looks like it was quite robust, maybe before I got here, certainly while I was here, and that's the way it should be, to be able to argue and to do it peacefully. So I want to thank you.
It's like my family's dinner table.
Or the Rules Committee.
Yeah, the Rules Committee. Yeah.
But I would just, since I'm not sure all the questions might have been asked, and they probably, the best ones have already been asked, but let me just say, Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for the United Nations, in a September speech, said that she was deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Kashmir and noted, and I quote her, "I have appealed particularly to India to ease the current lockdowns or curfews, to ensure people's access to basic services, and that all due process rights are respected for those who have been detained. It is important that the people of Kashmir are consulted and engaged in any decision-making process, and that have an impact on their future." And at one of our Foreign Affairs Committee hearings on October 22nd, Ambassador Wells made a point, and he said he welcomed the Pakistani leader's recent statements, which said, we believe the foundation for any successful dialogue between India and Pakistan is based on Pakistan taking sustained and irreversible steps against militants and terrorists on its territory. We believe that direct dialogue between India and Pakistan, as outlined in the 1972 Simla Agreement, holds the most potential for reducing tensions. If anyone would want to comment on those expressions, I would appreciate it. But I would also ask you, and I don't know if this has been asked, one of the points that I've made, and I've held 15 hearings on China's enormous influence and footprint all over the world, including in Africa, but also other places in the world. And I'm wondering, you know, they have territorial claims that impact Kashmir, the Ladakh in particular, and I'm wondering what their role is now in this crisis.
About Ladakh, are we talking about Ladakh? Ladakh has welcomed abrogation of Article 370, and they have also welcomed being a new separate union territory. They had been fighting for it for a long time, and after a long time, Ladakh has now been granted union territory status, which in India's term means that it is run by federally run territory. And beyond that, I think I have not seen any other issues about Article 370 at all in Ladakh at all. I mean, they've been actually granted what they wanted.
May I add to that, please?
Make sure your mic's on, yeah.
Yes, my mic is on. I'm
Good.
also very loud. So I want to respectfully disagree with my colleague on the panel, and I'll be happy to submit documentation to the commission that reflects that, in fact, Ladakh is not a uniform, does not have a uniform response to the abrogation of Article 370. In fact, there is ambivalence. Some members, some people from Ladakh are happy about the abrogation. They want to be part of Union territory. But what the actual effect of the abrogation is very alarming to them. So while they may have wanted to have a further alliance with India, the ecological and demographic implications of the abrogation are very alarming for some people. So it's certainly not a uniform picture. And then there was a question that you asked before about our comments on some of the different agreements with respect to Kashmir. And what I would say is this. I think what they reinforce is that this is an international issue. This is not an internal affair for India. But what I would say in 2019 is that if we proceed with the Kashmir dispute as a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, 15 years later, somebody else is going to be here sitting at this table talking about human rights violations in Kashmir. Until the fundamental issue of self-determination is resolved with respect for the rights of minorities, be they ethnic or religious, we are going to continue in the cycle of violence. And as I noted in my testimony, I have 4 generations of my family who have been impacted by this. I don't want my children and I don't want my grandchildren to be in the same position where they're advocating for basic human rights for the people and their extended families.
Yeah, so China. My colleagues have testified about China, not just its domestic human rights record, but its role in foreign policy. And I think we can agree that China does not play a positive role on human rights at the international stage. As to whether they care about anybody in their claimed territory in the region or in the Indian claimed or Pakistani cleared area, I can assume that they don't, because they don't seem to care about human rights for anybody, including their own citizens. So that's not really the issue. Could they play a productive role? Perhaps, as an envoy and on the diplomatic level. But honestly, if you wanted to enlist an ally in raising these issues as members of Congress, I would look to the European Union and the members of ASEAN and other regional fora to help internationalize these issues, because for too long, India has, especially India, but sometimes Pakistan, has demanded that this be considered either a domestic or a bilateral issue, and it hasn't gotten us anywhere. Human Rights Watch has been writing reports since we weren't even human rights. We used to be called Asia Watch. We've been writing reports on this for decades about abuses by both sides, and it's not working. Whatever each side is doing is not working. So it's really time to internationalize the response. I would agree with that.
And just to underscore that point, it isn't just U.S. lawmakers who've been turned away from Kashmir. EU lawmakers have made similar requests, and they too have been turned away. There is a growing international consensus that Kashmir is absolutely an international issue. Human rights observers and journalists from across the world should be allowed admission.
I think Kashmir absolutely should be an international issue, because Kashmir is primarily an issue of terrorism. So all terrorism should be international issue. I agree with that. I think everyone should talk about Kashmir. You, me, everyone, because that is where the fountainhead of terrorism in Asia is. And we need to eradicate that before we can even talk about human rights.
Just really quickly, I don't think there's a single report that I've ever seen or any type of documentation that would ever say that somehow the greatest threat of Islamic violent extremism somehow originates in Kashmir. I think there's absolutely no foundation for that belief.
If I could.
Dangerous place in the world. How are we saying that we have not read reports about Kashmir being dangerous? It's on testimony. You must know. President Clinton has called it the most dangerous place in the world.
If I could ask John Sifton, what do you say about that?
Sorry.
Because, John will know, he's been before hearings I've had in the past, and I remember when it was Asia Watch. But what do you say?
I mean, look, outside of human rights in particular, obviously whenever there's a geopolitical dispute between two nuclear-armed countries, that makes it an international concern and a potential threat to international peace and security, which gives the United Nations Security Council jurisdiction under its Chapter 7 powers. China could stand aside, to answer your question, and allow consideration, more consideration at the Security Council level. But again, if you really want allies on the human rights issues, again, I would say the EU and other concerned states, because I think what the Indian government is dealing with here back in Delhi is, I think their Ministry of Foreign Affairs knows that this hearing is going on and that there's concern, and that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is concerned. But I'm not sure that just because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs knows there's this international attention, that the Prime Minister's office knows it in all of its fullness. Because he came here, he was greeted quite warmly by some members of Congress, some members of the U.S. government. And it may be that the sort of bubble of that is not allowing him or his advisors to see the full scope of the international concern. So anything you can do to work together with other countries, other parliamentarians, to get through to the Indian government is going to help. Because again, you're not going to fix any of this unless you start acknowledging that there are problems. So if India continues to say, we don't have a problem, we just have to stamp out Islamic terrorism, they're not going to solve the problem. Because they've been doing that for 25 years and it hasn't worked.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And again, I apologize for being late. I will look forward to reading your statements. It's amazing you go from one part of the world to the other, and there's just so much tragedy and sadness. At the end of the day, it's all preventable. If goodwill exists and people are willing to talk, dialogue, better things can happen. And having just left the Sahel hearing, it's very troubling. But as you probably know, the chairman and I are also we serve on the China Commission. He's chairman. I'm ranking member. I used to be chairman. We're doing a great job, I think, together at our staffs. And we are concerned about China and its undue influence, very negative influence globally, everywhere. That's why I was asking what role they might be playing, positively or negatively. So
they always play a negative role.
Look what they're doing to the look what they're doing to the Uyghurs. I mean, it's concentration camps, right. And we've had hearings on that, as the chairman knows so well. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Thanks for. I'm at a loss. Let me do this. Let me say a few closing remarks. Then I want to give everybody an opportunity to say whatever they want to say, whatever we've not asked here. But let me say this before I yield to you for your final words. Look, we're here because we are genuinely concerned about the human rights situation in Kashmir, and we're here because we have constituents who are, our friends, who, people who we care deeply about, who have relatives who they can't get a hold of, who are deeply concerned about their health and their well-being, and if any of us, as has already been mentioned, we have family members in dangerous places, and we worry about them all the time, and to not be able to get a hold of them is particularly difficult. Yes, we have not been able to get international journalists and the UN into Kashmir. We have not been able to get U.S. senators into Kashmir. I hope that changes. But to the extent that can change soon, I think the discussions we have are going to be easier because they're going to be based on on consensus at least on what what people see, who don't have a stake in one side or the other. But look, the situation is of deep concern, and our interest in this issue is not going to go away. And again, we can get into this cycle of blaming this or blaming that, but then never getting to the point of where we're actually doing anything constructive to address people's human rights challenges or to address the hardships that people are going through. And we got to figure out how to get beyond that. The UN High Commissioner's Office has made some really good recommendations. We've put them into the record here. I mean, I hope India takes them seriously. We should have a discussion. I mean, they should be engaged with the UN talking about these things. And I think to the extent that people get a false impression based on the lack of attention to human rights issues by some in our government right now, please know that there is bipartisan concern about this. I mean, Chris Smith left. I mean, he's a conservative, I'm a Republican, I'm a liberal Democrat. We can sometimes not agree on what to have for lunch. But when it comes to upholding people's rights, protecting religious freedom, protecting the dignity of people, no matter where they are, we're in sync. So we're going to continue to try to find ways to move this issue forward, to address the human rights challenges. And I don't say this is not a threat. It's just, I mean, we are genuinely concerned. We're not going to go away on this issue. And I think for everybody here, despite the differences of kind of approaches and opinions, I mean, I think we all want to see the human rights challenges addressed. We all want to see people's rights respected. I hope we all do anyway, but that's what I believe anyway. So so I know people feel strongly, and we heard the passions here today. But I want you to know I appreciate each and every one of you being here. And so I will now yield to you to say whatever you think you should say for the record, or whatever we didn't ask, or any recommendations you have, or whatever you want. So I don't know who wants to go for it. Not in the audience, on the table here. Doctor.
Thank you, Co-Chairman. I would just like to say that for 70 years, Kashmiris have been denied the right to self-determination, and they've been denied the opportunity to determine their own political future through a plebiscite, as promised by the UN Security Council resolutions in the post-partition era. During that time, Kashmiris have come out in the streets. They came out in the streets throughout the post-partition era. They came out in the streets after 1989. They came out in the streets in 2008, 2010, 2011, 2016. They've been demonstrating their aspiration for their political future by coming out in the streets, right? And so one of the most popular protest forms that we've seen in Kashmir, at least since 1989, has been the form of, it's called the UNO Chilo. It's a popular march. Thousands of people come in the streets and march to the headquarters of the UN Military Observer Group in Kashmir and take memos and petitions, right, articulating their demand for the right to determine their own political future. The Kashmir issue has always been internationalized, right? And the UN has this very, very important kind of place in Kashmiri political identity and political consciousness and political imagination. That's because Kashmir is an international dispute, and it always has been, and it continues to be to this day. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights began expressing serious concern after India's use of excessive force through pellet-firing shotguns against innocent protesters, unarmed protesters in 2016 especially, started requesting access for monitors at that time, which led to the publication of the reports that we're talking about in 2018 and 2019. Those reports mark the international character of the Kashmir dispute, and they have been heartening, right? The international attention that has been paid to Kashmir since 2016, since 2018, and today with this hearing. Like, this is heartening that the international community is recognizing the international nature of the dispute. We've been talking about the recommendations in those reports, and many of the recommendations are very, very important. One of the recommendations that I'd just like to highlight in closing is the recommendation, it's the only recommendation that the Office of the High Commissioner makes to the Human Rights Council, and that is recommending the establishment of a commission of inquiry that would cover the human rights situation on both sides of the line of control, in Indian-controlled Kashmir and in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. So it would be my hope that the U.S. Congress would use its leverage in various ways that it can to support that recommendation for a commission of inquiry.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Whoever was ready to go next can.
All right.
Well,
yeah, thank you. So I want to second what you said about a fact-finding mission. I think that's very important. I also liked what you had asked us earlier about where we can all agree on something. And I think another place where I would like to think we could all agree is that children shouldn't be detained. I would like to think that's a pretty basic thing. So I would like to think that's like a place where we could all come together. I'd also like to think we could come together that adults shouldn't be detained without due process, but I have a feeling some people here might not agree with me, but I'd like to think that we live in a world where everyone should have process. I also feel that we often talk about Kashmir in terms of India and Pakistan, but it's also a local issue, and Kashmiris themselves, I think, I'm very happy that me and Sela are here today, and that we have, and Sunanda, I'm very happy that there are Kashmiri voices here today. I think it's very important.
We appreciate very much that you've accepted our invitation.
And it's not just people talking about us, but us speaking for ourselves,
Right.
and I really value that. But I think when we talk about the solution, it's not just bilateral. It really involves people from Kashmir and what they want, and a quest for human dignity for all Kashmiris. And last but not least, I think what's also on the list of kind of a path forward would be having credible local elections. And since I can remember, I think people take to the streets because they don't ever feel that elections are credible.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure, I can go next.
Ms. Eshai, thank you.
Yes. So I think I would like to reiterate how very much I support Haley's suggestions and your suggestions for steps forward. And I would like to, again, reiterate that for Kashmiri people, this is their day-to-day life. This is not a political issue that they read about, that they can afford to take extreme positions on. It impacts their day-to-day life. Their schooling is interrupted. They're separated from their family members. So I would really, just in closing, encourage all of our members of Congress, when discussing the topic of Kashmir, to pause whenever it becomes a discussion of a bilateral agreement between India and Pakistan. We know who holds power, and it's not the Kashmiri people. But what you don't know is that this recording will be couriered by someone who is able to go by plane, by car, and go into Kashmir, and people in Kashmir are going to hear that in the halls of US Congress, their plight was being discussed. And for people who have no hope, this offers some hope, that there are people who care so much about their welfare, that there's potentially a future with peace and prosperity in that valley. And for that opportunity to speak to you about Kashmir, we are all very, very deeply, deeply grateful.
And I appreciate you both reminding us that this is a local issue as well, because sometimes we get caught up in the, the big picture stuff.
You wanted me to go? Okay. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me here. I don't have a contrary evidence to this, but I think this is the first time a Kashmiri Hindu is speaking on behalf of a Kashmiri Hindu is in the Congress. So, Chairman, I really want to thank you. I cannot tell you how much that means to me and to my community. That means a lot to us, that you're giving us a platform to speak. So thank you very much. I just want to make 2 or 3 quick points. This plebiscite thing comes up all the time, and the original mandate of the plebiscite was that everyone should sort of back off from where they are. So that means Kashmir is not just with India, it's also divided in Pakistan, and a part of it is also held with China. So good luck to this Congress getting China vacating Kashmir. So if you can do that, I mean, that's not. So plebiscite is off the table. It's not going to happen in ever. So I can, and as I said that, it's not because of India. Good luck. Everyone who's booing, good luck getting Pakistan to vacate, POK. I mean, Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and good luck getting China to vacate. So having said that, I also want to draw your attention.
Wait, I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to say we can never give up on standing for the principle that people have a right to their own self-determination. I think you'll even agree with that, so that's done. I mean, you're right.
I also want to add to that, that India has not occupied Kashmir, and I cannot say this in the thing. Kashmir was never a separate part. Civilizationally, I want anyone to show me one shred of evidence that India has occupied Kashmir. India has not occupied Kashmir. Kashmir is an integral part and always been. India is not just a 70-year-old nation state that you see. India is a 5,000-year-old civilization. There is no Kashmir without India. There is no India without Kashmir. It's both ways. And I will say this at the top of my voice because this is so important to me. Having said that, I also want to draw your attention to thousands of Kashmiri Hindu refugees who are still languishing in the camps. So we want, through this committee, if we can draw attention and, for Indian government to be cognizant of their lives right now. It's been 30 years and their lives haven't been better. And that's another thing. Also, the last point that I want to make, and we must really look beyond agendas, and we must look beyond this manufactured narrative. It's very important. It's very important to go and speak to ordinary Kashmiris. What will they tell you? They will tell you, we want to live. We want to live. They will not, no, within Indian Constitution. I will just end this. So, if this House is going to allow separatist slogans here, I think I'll have to walk out because I cannot allow that. So, India, this is not being very respectful, Congressman. But
I'm sorry,
anyway.
I'm trying to bang my pen here.
Yes.
I mean, everybody deserves to be heard here, so that's all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I just want to make one last point. India's democratic credentials are unmatched. They have successfully, in a democratic setup, defeated insurgencies in Punjab and Northeast. It's time to strengthen India against this insurgency in Kashmir, and the human rights problem will be solved forever. Yeah. Thank you.
And let me say, I think I want to point out that we all agree on something here, and that is, as you pointed out, that we should talk to the average person in Kashmir.
Yes.
I'd like to be able to have the opportunity to go, right?
Yes.
And I mean, so we all agree on this, right?
Very soon.
And I think that's
I will, I think it's coming very soon.
Okay, all right. Well, I hope
it will happen very soon.
Who wants to go next?
I think we can end with Arjun. Yeah.
So I apologize if I was, as non-Kashmiri, non-Indian, if I was speaking for other people. But one of the great things about working for Human Rights Watch is you don't need to worry about speaking for other people because you're just speaking for humans. It's human rights for Kashmiris, Indians, Pakistanis, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Sikhs. So that's what I meant to be doing. I think it's really good to be frank here for a second about the political realities. Not necessarily about political realities on the international stage, what's possible and impossible, because of course those things can change, but frank about the realities of what Congress can do here this year, right now, to affect this situation. Because obviously this isn't the Congress of India, it's the Congress of the US. So you have a role in telling US officials how to address these problems, and that's what I wanted to focus on. This is a bipartisan issue, and it's changed. When I first started working in my current position at Human Rights Watch, it was very difficult to get human rights issues about India writ large or Pakistan on the agenda of Congress. But that's changed. over the last couple of years, you've seen more and more interest in India by members of Congress, and it's been bipartisan. You mentioned Representative Smith, but of course, Representative Royce, who's no longer with us in the Congress, held hearings in his committee on India and religious freedom issues. And it goes to Pakistan, too. Pakistan catches a lot of grief and criticism bipartisanly by Congress. So what helps, I think, is when Congress uses its own voice with the Indian government, whether it's in CODELs or staff DELs or in talking to the embassy here, to get the message to India, to the government of India, that their old game, that they can sort of lobby their way out of everything, which many governments are guilty of this. They think they can just pay enough lobbyists or work enough of their constituents to get Congress off their back. It's not going to work. It's just not going to work. Things have changed in Washington with respect to the U.S. Congress and India, and they can't just wiggle their way out of it by trying to pressure Congress, which translates into them thinking we've got to change our behavior. We can't just keep pounding our fist and saying this is a domestic issue you can't tell us about. It's all about Pakistan, all the other things they pound the fist on the table. Eventually they're going to give up. Either they hope you'll give up or they're going to give up. So I think that's what the role of Congress can play with respect to India. With respect to the government of the United States of America, there's a lot more the State Department could be doing, either behind the scenes or in other meetings that they have. Ambassador Brownback went. That's a way in. In particular, Trump administration officials, because I think the government does care about the Trump administration and what it thinks. They're sophisticated enough to recognize that Senator Brownback, Ambassador Brownback, and Vice President Pence, if they speak about human rights issues, whether it's religious freedom or other issues in India, that's going to have an impact. So I think encouraging the Vice President's office in particular, because they've spoken about religious liberty, and Brownback to talk will help in the overarching thing. And then there's, the whole of government approach. What's supposed to happen is that every U.S. official who visits India should raise all the issues that the U.S. government has before the government of India. So, for instance, the Deputy Defense Secretary for Acquisitions was just in India talking about arms sales. Why can't he say, we're really worried about the situation in Kashmir? So all those examples. And then at the HRC, this is ironic to say the least, but since the U.S. pulled out of the Human Rights Council, it's very difficult to get the State Department to intervene in Geneva to help push forward. So if you want a commission of inquiry or a special rapporteur or even a special procedure of some other type, like a fact-finding mission, the U.S. can work behind the scenes, but they don't have a role at the table, and they certainly can't vote. They can lobby other governments to vote, and the only message I have on that is it may be the case that Secretary of State Pompeo and the Trump administration are formally against the Human Rights Council, but the reality is we still have a mission in Geneva. They still talk to other governments. They could totally use their leverage to ask the Human Rights Commission, other members of the Human Rights Commission who care about this, to act. And so pushing state to do that, not at the Pompeo level, but at the rank and file level, totally intelligent way to go. So that's it. Those are my sort of frank, very nuts and bolts recommendations for Congress.
No, we appreciate those recommendations. Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Sethi.
Earlier on this panel, I was accused of having an agenda. Just now, some of my colleagues were accused of having an agenda. This is the cost of speaking truth to Modi, Amit Shah, the BJP, RSS, and Hindu nationalists. The truth is, I do have an agenda, but it's not the agenda that my colleague thinks. I'm a human rights lawyer. I believe that everyone in this world should have their civil and human rights respected, regardless of race, faith, national origin. Today in Kashmir, there are more than 700,000 uniformed officers, okay? Those officers don't have the ability to differentiate between Muslims, Sikhs, and the LGBTQ community. Instead, they are engaged in a mass suspension of human rights. In Kashmir today, they are being tortured. Kashmiris have been arbitrarily detained. They have been blinded.
All right, please, yeah.
They have been blinded. They cannot access medicine. They cannot worship freely. They cannot speak freely. And so what I would submit to you today is this. India leads the world in internet blackouts. If India and my colleagues in the back are telling the truth, why not allow lawmakers like you into Kashmir? Why not allow European observers? Why not allow human rights observers from across the world to see for themselves? The truth is that India is hiding its atrocities not just in Kashmir, its atrocities in Assam. It's hiding the rising hate violence that's spreading across this country. I want to thank every representative who showed up here today, and I urge you to continue to do the good work of meeting with your constituents who are affected by Hindu nationalism, and that's it.
So, I thank you all for being here, and this has been a long hearing, and I appreciate your patience, but it has been very helpful for, I think, this commission, and I look forward to being with all of you in Kashmir.
Yes. You're a great person to end on. I didn't know if you were Kashmiri, so I felt like I was preempted. I was like, is it Kashmiri? I don't know. I'm sorry. We never formally met. How did you see? Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.